Transport Committee. The main item for discussion today will be our second meeting talking about the potential introduction of smarter road user charging. Can you all please make sure your electronic devices are switched off or onto silent mode? And can I start by asking our clerk, Paul Goodchild, if any apologies have been received?
Thank you, Chair. No apologies for absence this morning.
Thank you very much. Can I ask the committee next to note the recommendations set out at item 2, declarations of interest, and ask if any members have any other interest to declare?
Noted.
Thank you. Item 3 is the minutes of the last meeting on 17th of January 2023. Can you confirm these can be signed by me as a correct record?
Agreed.
Thank you. Item 4 is our summary list of actions. Can we note the completed and ongoing actions arising from previous meetings of the committee?
Noted.
Thank you very much. And so now we swiftly move on to our main item of business, which is a question and answer session with our invited guests on the potential introduction of smarter road user charging. Now, to provide some background on this, the London Assembly is a scrutiny body that holds the Mayor and mayoral advisors to account by examining their work and making sure that priorities from Londoners are delivered. Our investigation into the future of smart road user charging is primarily to consider the practical issues around the potential introduction of smarter road user charging in London, and this is a two-meeting investigation. We held our first meeting on the 14th of December 2022. We're also continuing to accept and consider written submissions in response to our call for evidence until the 10th of March. If you have views, please do send them in. So now I'd like to welcome our guests for this item. We have Christina Calderato, who is the Director of Transport Strategy and Policy at Transport for London. We have Michael Roberts, who is the Chief Executive of London TravelWatch. We have Sandeep Shingadia, who is the Director of Strategic Partnerships and Delivery Integration at Transport for West Midlands. Thank you for coming. And we also have Steve Gooding, who is the Director of the RAC Foundation and a very experienced civil servant, to give us more of a government perspective as well. So if I would like to lead off with my first question today. It's to each of you, but I'd like to go to the guests who are not Transport for London first and then come to you, Christina, if that's okay. My question is, how can smarter road user charging support policy goals such as reducing air pollution, tackling climate change, road traffic and road danger? And are these goals all complementary and of equal importance? So starting with Steve Gooding, if that's all right.
Okay, working? Yeah, okay, thank you. Sorry, technology defeating me. There's quite a few elements to that question, and I don't want to take up the whole morning trying to answer them all. There are various things that can be attacked through pricing. So I think on a pure economic basis, there's always a sense in which one can influence behaviour by making things more or less expensive. I think we'd all accept that. I think it's difficult to do in some circumstances. I think on the one hand, you can look at the evident success over the years of the original congestion charge in reducing the amount of traffic in the very centre of London. I think what we find looking at London, but also particularly looking around the world, is the bigger the area that you try to cover, the bigger the challenge that you've got in coming up with a system that works. Second, even then, if you're not covering an entire country area, if you're covering a subset of a country, if you're covering a city, an area as large as Greater London, you've still got boundary issues that if you're trying to do something that affects the decisions of people who live there, it's one thing, and people who live there and have cars registered there and that's where they use them. If, however, like Greater London, you have a lot of people coming in and out from outside, then I'm thinking here about things like the technology that you would have in the vehicle. One might not necessarily have that technology if one isn't in London and required to have it. One might be living in one of the surrounding counties or even further afield. And lastly, I would say there is clearly a good sense in saying, well, there are various objectives that are trying to be achieved here. They're all trying to be achieved through a price. From the user perspective, let's bundle those together and have one system and one price Wouldn't that be a lot more straightforward? And I think from a user perspective, there's a great deal to be said for that. I think, though, you also have to bear in mind that, in a sense, by doing that, it does risk blunting the extent to which the user sees what that incentive is about. So, Chair, you mentioned road safety as well as environmental, as well as congestion issues here. I think we could probably all say that if there were less road traffic, that would have a positive environmental impact. On a road safety impact, sometimes slightly less clear-cut, less traffic. Obviously, there's less exposure to vehicles, but if that's the objective, then I wonder whether there's I guess what I'd say is there needs to be a complementary mix of measures rather than thinking that there's a single silver bullet or a single thing one can do here. And having said that, it occurs to me that's probably true for all three.
Okay, thank you very much. We will obviously be digging into a lot of the issues that you've raised in more detail later on in the meeting. But yeah, broadly, that's really helpful. Thank you. Michael from London TravelWatch, what's your perspective on this?
Thank you, Chair. We would support the development and trialling of innovative techniques such as a smarter road user charging system in London to deliver the three objectives that you said, and I think are the ambition of the Mayor in his plan. I think we would probably amplify the kind of ambition beyond cutting global and local pollution and reducing congestion. And I think really we need to also be thinking about the opportunity to address issues such as accidents on the road network. And we need to be thinking in any approach that adopts road user charging about how do we maximise the benefits for the most disadvantaged members in the community in the capital. I think the kind of key thing I would say at this stage in the discussion is that I think the prospects for success of a charging scheme in the future, which is genuinely smart, is that it needs to be seen as part of a wider transport strategy for the capital. We can't just look at road use and charging for road use in isolation. There needs to be a holistic approach. It's essentially about trying to improve the consistency with which more Londoners can travel for shorter journey times, and it's about people movement rather than vehicle movement. And that, I think, demands a holistic approach, which embraces lots of elements, some of which Steve has, I think, touched upon. The ones that strike me as worth mentioning is that an approach should think about the use of road user charging as an opportunity to reset the relative cost of all modes of transport in the capital, so that we're getting the system working as well as it can across all of those modes. The approach needs to carefully consider the potential to reallocate road space, which is freed up as a result of road user charging, for example, to the benefit of public transport or active travel modes. Road user charging clearly is an opportunity which should be seized in terms of raising funds to improve alternatives to, in particular, private motoring in the capital. And going to my earlier point about the need to consider certain segments of our community, the holistic approach needs to embrace, for example, at the early stages, an equality impact assessment, so that the design of any scheme is not just mitigating, but ideally benefiting those members of the community who need that help most.
Okay, thank you very much. So Sandeep, you represent a different part of the country to London. What's your perspective on this from a West Midlands side of things?
Thank you, Chair. So road user charging is something that we have explored in quite a lot of detail over a number of years. It's become an area of much discussion in the West Midlands. It's something that we went into quite a lot of work about a decade ago, really understanding some of the challenges, particularly driven by congestion, and what we would need to do to try and alleviate some of those challenges. And whilst the focus then was primarily around congestion, that has obviously broadened out into a range of other policy areas like the environment, thinking about road safety, thinking about the health and well-being of our residents across the West Midlands. And those themes have continued to follow through the work that we've done with our local transport plan, and in the latest iteration of that, we are really looking at the why and what some of the motives for change are across the West Midlands when it comes to the transport system, and really echoing some of the points that Steve and Michael have already made around you have to take a holistic view around the transport system. And there are a number of key drivers there, things like sustaining economic success, creating a fairer society, supporting local communities and places, becoming more active, so really focusing on the walk and wheel aspects of the transport system, and tackling the climate emergency. And what we are trying to work towards is a 45-minute region, but with 15-minute neighbourhoods. So thinking about the modes of transport that are at a very local level, the walk and wheel for a 15-minute access to your regional transport network, and creating a very connected transport system across the West Midlands. Now, when it comes to the ambitions of the LTP, there is a recognition that there are a number of things that we need to do to achieve all of those goals. And whilst we still do talk about the need to manage demand on the network, and things like road pricing are spoken about, it is still some way in terms of actually getting to an actual decision around, is this something that we would do? There's a lot to unpack before those decisions are made. But what we have been focusing on in the meantime is very much around the need for people to consider their behaviour when travelling. So how do we push some of that behavioural change element? How do we get the right alternatives in place? And how do we sustain some of those alternatives? Because we are at a point in a post-pandemic world where public transport usage isn't as high as it used to be. So when we talk about having the right alternatives in place, how are they going to be sustained without additional subsidy to make sure those alternatives are in place? So there's a number of areas there that we need to consider as part of a solution moving forwards, but very much in the thinking of the broader concept of managing demand on the network, and what tools and what processes and systems can we use to do that.
Thank you very much. And just quickly, have you actually set a traffic reduction target at a West Midlands level?
We have a number of targets around modal split and modal share that we would like to see. And what we have been very successful in is, in our major centres, we have seen a prevalence of public transport being the highest mode share, particularly suburban rail. In the rest of when we move away from the centres, there is still a dominance of private car trips, and that is a big challenge. And those are generally low vehicle occupancy, so 1 or 2 passengers at most, short distance car trips, which again highlights the importance of having a local transport system that works, but also connecting into some of the regional transport networks that we have.
Okay, thank you. And very interesting, you've set a 45-minute region kind of goal there. I wonder what that would be for London. Right, moving to Christina Calderato from TfL. Obviously, some of these goals have been formally put into your transport strategy now. How do you see smarter road charging supporting them in the future?
Yeah, so I think what we can see in London increasingly is that we have got this kind of triple challenge, which we've been talking about and which we've updated in the MTS. So toxic air pollution, the climate crisis, and traffic and congestion. But as you've said, the whole MTS is there, which includes a much wider range of objectives, including, crucially, Vision Zero and reducing road danger, the 80% sustainable mode share target, the traffic reduction figures, and then we've got this net zero carbon by 2030. Road user charging in some way, traffic reduction, could help achieve all of those things. So they are all complementary. And I think what we know and what everybody's kind of referred to is actually what we really need to do is move everybody around in a more sustainable way. And that's a multifaceted approach. So that means investment, it means providing infrastructure for people to make different choices. But road user charging can be part of how you use your space, limited road space that we have in London most effectively. So yes, all of those objectives are complementary. Road user charging could help to achieve all of them. Whether they're all equal or not, I think that's where you get into the design of a scheme can really kind of impact. The impacts can be different depending on how you design a scheme. So if you look at something like we have a congestion charge and we have an ultra-low emission zone, the congestion charge primary objective is to reduce traffic and congestion, but it does also reduce emissions. With the ULEZ, the primary objective is to reduce emissions, but we do also see that it has a traffic impact. So there are 2 different road user charging schemes, both reduce traffic and emissions, but because of those different objectives, they're designed in different ways to achieve their kind of primary purpose. And I think what we'd like to look at in terms of the future of road user charging is not having all those layered up different schemes with pointing in different directions, but actually integrating them so that you can have a single scheme which is designed to take account of all those objectives. That is going to be really complex, and I'm not trying to pretend that it isn't, but I think that's got to be the goal, that we make that simpler for people to interact with, that we can design a scheme that will help us achieve those objectives across the piece. And that's where we need to be looking at, I think, in terms of the future.
Okay, thank you very much. And I think you've all touched on the idea that it makes sense to bring in more objectives, but those multiple objectives risk making the scheme more complex and maybe blunting the purpose of it. So we'll have many questions on that in the second section of this meeting. I'm going to hand over now, though, to Assemblymember Baker for further questions.
Thank you, Chair, and thanks, Guess, for your contribution so far. It's good to have you all here. So I want to ask a bit more about the specifics around those policy goals that we've covered already. So air pollution, climate change, congestion, road danger. But I would just like to say, I think that as Christina said about the MTS, primarily it's got to be about getting people around to where they need to do, and sometimes where they need to get to, and sometimes I feel like that's pushed down as a priority and as a policy goal. So I wonder if I could ask the panel overall, how can different variations in charges, such as by distance, time, location, emissions, the sort of things we look at, how can those support different policy goals? And is there a possibility that they'll have any unintended consequences? We are also going to get into a lot more detail about some of these as well, so I think this is probably quite a top level question. Is that right? Anyone like to come in on that? So how do the variations in charges support the different policy goals?
I can pick up a bit on that if you like, because it probably leads off from what I was saying with those two previous schemes. So I think we can see that depending on what those objectives are, you can kind of point a scheme or a pricing scheme more squarely at one of them to try and achieve a type of behaviour change. So whether you're trying to get people to shift into a different type of vehicle, or if you're trying to get them to travel at a different day or avoid a particular area at a different time of day. And I think you can see that through the charges that we've already have in place. So through the congestion charge and the ultra-low emission zone, in terms of those parameters that you mentioned, we've kind of got, there's time of day is already captured, location is captured, emissions are captured. The element that isn't captured currently is distance. And at the moment we have the fact that they are in different schemes which have kind of different stated objectives. So I think the challenge is how you stitch all of those things together such that you are trying to incentivise people wherever possible, and particularly at the busiest times of day and in the busiest places, to choose the most sustainable forms of travel, and where that's possible, switch away from the car. And then for the vehicles that are remaining that essential traffic, that the road network functions efficiently for them. So all of those things can work in, all of those are part of the design of a scheme. And I think what we need to consider, particularly in London, is what the different needs are across the city, and make sure that you're kind of taking account of those local circumstances, which is what we've done with the current schemes, the congestion charge, which applies in central London, which was, particularly busy and congested at those busiest times of day, which is why that scheme was introduced. Emissions is a different thing, applies 24 hours a day. So it's, in terms of integrating them, there will, of course, be those trade-offs, but I think the really important thing is that you understand what you're trying to achieve and then what the local circumstances are, and you tailor accordingly. It's going to have to be flexible, and it will be complicated. The trick for us is making sure that complex kind of scheme design sits in the back, but it's really simple for people to interact with.
Thank you. Steve?
Yes, so I was going to say the thing that... two things, really. So one is the distance element is probably the bit that's most technically difficult to implement for something like a city or a citywide scheme. Not that it's impossible to measure how far vehicles go, but if, at its simplest, if one just has a cordon around an area and establishes you've crossed the cordon, that's it, you're in, that's a lot easier than you've crossed the cordon, you're in. Now how far are you going to go? How are we going to find that out? How are we going to do that in a system that isn't itself overly expensive or isn't prone to cheating? And indeed, how much do we care? So, for example, if you cross the cordon, you're therefore adding to congestion and you're adding to the road safety risk, but you're driving an electric vehicle, therefore your tailpipe emissions are zero, so we're perhaps not so worried about how far you're driving, but we're particularly worried about how you drive. And that's where I'd say the second thing is thinking about how things interact. And probably the most important thing, and I know this is in Christina's mind and that of others working on this in TfL, is don't think about a scheme as something that is here, now, this is what we're going to do, and it's going to stay like this forever. Think, here's the elements of something that it will be sensible to do, but let's recognise it's going to have to be tuned over time. And the example I'd give you, I'll roll back to the start of the original congestion charge, where there was a very healthy discount if you had a very low emission vehicle. So one objective, let's reduce congestion, still allow people to drive around, but let's incentivise them to have the cleanest vehicles. Ultimately, you reach a point where that incentive has worked, and lots of us have got the cleanest vehicles, and so congestion starts to come up again. It needs to be rethought. Second, let's only allow people in if they're willing to pay. Well, perhaps those are the people who are in a hurry. People in a hurry, and I speak with the greatest generalisation, not necessarily the safest drivers. So that's where you'd be thinking, well, they're prioritising their trip, they want to get somewhere in a hurry, but we're going to need some complementary measures to make sure they're still driving safely.
Thank you, that's very helpful. Sandeep?
Thank you. Steve touches on some really interesting points, because even the work we did 10, 12 years ago really focused on getting to a point where time, distance, place charging may be something that needed to be explored in more detail, but the technology wasn't quite there at the time. Going for a cordon charge is quite a blunt instrument. Yes, it can have the right sort of impact in terms of reducing congestion, but it does have a range of other impacts on the boundaries, etc., which need to be factored in. And just using some hypothetical examples, thinking about Birmingham as a city where we do have problems with poor air quality, we've recently introduced a clean air zone around the inner ring road. But if you were getting to a hypothetical place where you would target certain corridors or certain routes which have poor air quality, so thinking about a time, distance, place type of charge, it's then the inequity of what happens in that area. Because what we're generally finding is those are areas, generally inner city areas, where we've got high levels of deprivation. So you do have then that impact of what does that do to those local people living in the area that are now faced with a charge because of the unintended consequences of people wanting to drive through their area and access the central core. So this is where it comes back to some of those points I made before around what are the other measures where we are thinking about driving some of the behaviour change that we need to see across not just the West Midlands, but in general transport terms, people thinking about the journeys that they are making. But also then thinking about those alternatives. And when I talk about the 15 minutes, it is very much focusing on some of the localised improvements we can make to our cycling and walking networks, and how do we actually encourage more of that to happen rather than some of the very short distance car trips which are contributing to some of those impacts around congestion, poor air quality, road safety. And the whole point around moving to getting that behavioural shift in terms of different types of vehicles which are, as Steve pointed out, potentially incentivised originally, but generally you still have the issues of congestion, whether it's an electric car or an internal combustion engine car. You still got the other impacts of congestion, severance, and so on, which need to be factored in against some of those broader goals of particularly where we're trying to see better accessibility and permeability of cycling and walking routes, as opposed to provision of highway space on our roads. So the whole point around how do we actually encourage some more of that shift and start to reallocate road space as part of some of those broader policy discussions.
Thank you. Good.
Essentially, this is an exercise in trying to change behaviour to achieve those goals through the use of price. And in particular, the prize here is the opportunity for technology to differentiate price in the light of certain circumstances, which I think was Christina's point, which sounds great. But if I go to first principles from the point of view of the travelling public, what is it that I need in order to make an informed choice to change my behaviour? And two of the things that strike me as being important, first of all, I have some understanding before I decide how to undertake a journey, what is the likely cost I would incur in either taking the car to make that journey versus other forms of transport. And the second issue is, what are the alternatives that are open to me should I wish to change my behaviour? The second point, I think, plays to what I said earlier about seeing road user charging as a key part of a wider strategy. Going to my first point about essentially the predictability and understanding in advance of what am I likely to pay if I take this option and this mode rather than that option. It seems to me that kind of an interesting challenge in using differentiated pricing is that actually it might not make that very obvious to me up front. If we have fully dynamic road pricing where the price is changing by each 100-metre section of the road by a minute of the day, putting it at its crudest, I'm pretty certain I wouldn't know in advance at 9:10 in the morning, travelling from here into Tower Hill or something by car. I wouldn't know in advance what the price is going to be. I think, therefore, as a user, that feels like a difficult situation in which to be in terms of trying to make up my mind about, what are the choices I want to make. Over time, you might get experience, but I think differentiation, I think, is great in some respects, but I think poses challenges in other respects if it's taken to the nth degree of perfection. And one of the thoughts that occurs to me is that one might not want to go for fully dynamic pricing. But then what is it that's short of that is the best option? Actually, should we be thinking about something for roads in London which replicates the public transport approach now, where you have oyster zones? Should we have, so your price per mile in the peak is different here, in outer London or in zone 8 or whatever, as opposed to zone 1. And I think that needs a lot more thought in terms of understanding what's the best way of encouraging people to make those changes in behaviour.
Thanks very much. Just go back to Chair, but just like saying, I know we'll come back to this, but just to say that if we're implying change behaviour, that if we're saying it's all about driving behaviour change, that does imply people have choices, and I think we do need to make sure we recognise that some people actually don't, for all sorts of things, don't actually have choices, but I'm sure we'll come back to that.
Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah, we do have further questions about cost structures and potential things later on. Right, over to Assemblymember Rogers now.
Thank you, Chair. Question, I think I'll start with Steve for this one. It's around public opinion. So do you believe that public opinion could be in favour of a switch to smarter road user charging, either now or in future discussion with more detail? And I think that question also raises another question, which is, what do you think current public opinion is about road user charging?
Okay, that's quite a tricky one. And I say that because I think current public opinion about road user charging is we haven't really thought about it and we'd rather not think about it. And when we're thinking about public opinion, I quite often get asked, what do motorists think about X, Y, or Z? My reaction generally is, well, they probably don't think about it at all because they don't want to.
Could you bring the microphone a bit closer to you or point it more directly at you? Okay. Yeah, sorry, thank you.
Oh, there we go, it moves. Extraordinary. What I was saying was, I think, what is public opinion on road user charging? By and large, most members of the public are very happy not to have to think about it at all and don't. When they are prompted to think about it, instinctively, a lot of them go, I'm not sure about that. And then they will think, how is that going to affect me and my lifestyle and the travel arrangements I make? And the third thing, and this harks to some of the points that others on the panel here have made, their first thought is very often, but I can't possibly change the way I travel. And that's where the issue comes in of what exactly is the question they're being asked? Because the question is, how do you feel about us introducing a charge for the trips that you currently make so that it's going to become a lot more expensive for you? Generally speaking, it's not going to go that well. If the proposition is, we've noticed the pattern of trips here, we'd like it to be different, and that would mean you might need to make some changes too, but here's the good news, or here's the complementary measures, or here's how this could work, then the reaction could be different. I think there's always going to be a hardcore of people who think all change is bad, they're deeply suspicious, and many people who think I can't change my ways, as we've heard, perhaps for some of them at least, that might be the case. So I think recognising not everyone is up for change, not everyone would find that easy, but what is the proposition in the round that people are being faced with, I think is the important thing.
Thank you. Michael, if I could address the same questions to you.
I support a lot of what Steve has said. We at TravelWatch haven't surveyed people, particularly within the capital, on this particular issue, certainly not recently. So I haven't got any new insight based on asking people what they think directly on this issue. I'm mindful of the work that Campaign for Better Transport has done in this space, and I think the committee is probably already well aware of that from the session that you had in December. But by way of reminder, I think their survey work identified that something of the order of 60% of people feel that this is nationally, feel that currently the approach to vehicle and road taxation is unfair. About 49% of them think that pay-as-you-drive is a better way of doing it, which isn't exactly a huge ringing endorsement to the extent that they do think about this. But that proportion increases to become a more significant show of support if, for example, mitigations are put in place for those people who genuinely have little or no alternative but to drive, and if indeed the money raised is pumped back into improving the alternatives. That would suggest, at least nationally, there is, how can one put it, a willingness to consider this as a way forward when that question is asked. My instinct would be that within London, given the nature of the public transport system and therefore the availability of alternatives, the stringency of some of the issues around congestion and around local air pollution, probably suggests that there's more appetite than nationally, but we haven't asked them, so I wouldn't know for sure.
I'm just interested in your thoughts on whether you think public opinion, how it would be affected if individual drivers might realise they'd pay more, less, or the same as they currently do to drive their vehicles. How close a link would there be with that and general support for road user charging?
I think if the proposition to people is that you're going to pay either the same or actually less if you travel in different ways at different times, that would increase the support for it. The practical issue is, amongst other things, how does this interact with the current revenue that is extracted from road users through taxes, and the extent to which they could be reduced at the same time as introducing a charging scheme in the capital. And I'm sure we'll come back to this, but that is, I think, a rather complicated question to try and answer.
Yes, and I think we're going to be asking you to answer the questions like that later.
Thank you.
So, Sandeep, if I go to you, I don't know if you've picked up anything from your work around public opinion on road user charging.
Yeah, well, we did do a lot of this when we were looking at different types of road user charging systems, and we have been engaging on our local transport plan recently, where we do talk about measures such as demand management, which would include things like road pricing. Some of the points have already been picked up, but I think it really comes down to, in terms of that public opinion, first of all, is a clear articulation of why. Why is this important? Why is this going to help us achieve some of those goals? And whilst we can always set that out at a very strategic level, it then comes back down to what does that mean for me as an individual? So as you've picked up, what does it cost me? Does it change the way that I can travel or may want to travel? And this whole notion of an acceptance that there will be winners and there will be losers, and do we understand how this would impact on different people? In terms of that public opinion, I think given where we are at the moment with the cost of living challenges and everything else, would this just be seen as yet another tax in inverted commas? But how do we look at this in the context of reforming things like road fund licence, fuel duty, and how do you consider all those in the round if we are really serious about driving that sort of behavioural change? So those are the areas that have often come up in conversations, getting that real understanding of who this impacts and how it impacts them, and being able to articulate a very clear story as to what it means for individuals away from. And I think and forgive me for saying this, but as transport professionals, we can sometimes get caught up in that bigger strategic picture of what we think the right things are to do. But it does come back to that very individual impact, and how does that impact the person who lives in a specific area or needs to travel at a certain time and their individual circumstances, and getting under the skin of that is quite important.
I think that's a very important point, and you raised the question of winners and losers, and I wonder how many people instinctively think that they'll be on the losing end of road user charging.
And the general view probably would be, well, this is yet another charge that I have to pay. But it then comes down to understanding the mechanics of the charge, the processes, the systems, and do you end up in a situation based on individual circumstances where it's negligible change or no change or a positive change for that person. But then it does come back down to what extent will something like that be able to drive a behavioural change in the way that person travels, what time of day they travel, what modes they travel by. Is it enough of a factor in driving some of that behavioural change that we would like to see?
Thank you. And finally, if I put the question to you, Christina, as TfL, I mean, obviously you've got the results of the consultation into ULEZ, which included road user charging. What information do you have about public opinion at the moment in London?
So I think one of the things that it's really important for us not to get kind of too drawn into is thinking specifically about what's public opinion on road user charging. And I think people have kind of picked this up, but it's not... we're not interested in the point isn't how popular is a mechanism. That we're not pursuing, nobody who's looking at road user charging is looking at it out of interest for the mechanism. It's about what type of city you want to live in, what are the outcomes we're trying to achieve, what would we like to see, and what's the role of road user charging in helping to deliver that. And I think that's what's really important about what we saw from consultation. It's asking people, what would you like to see a scheme deliver? What are the important things that it could try to address? Because then it's about trying to deliver policies which help give people the outcomes that they want to see. And then part of that is obviously, how does it impact me and my daily travel behaviour in terms of price and pricing mechanisms? But it's important to just remember that it's not just the only benefit is not about, it's not just about the cost and benefits of you paying a charge on that day. It's about what, as a city, a scheme is trying to achieve, and whether people people buy into the objectives of the scheme and the need for a scheme, and then that leads you into... But I think the dialogue needs to be really about what you're trying to achieve and the role of road user charging within that, and not simply focusing on a scheme.
If we did introduce road user charging in London, it would be one of the biggest reordering of transport in the city for decades. And whilst people might agree, as you say, with some of the objectives, surely you have to make sure that they're on board with the change. It's a huge change, and you would need to get people on board. So I think it is very important that we understand what public opinion is. And I'm sure TfL must have done some work to establish that before it started work on thinking about what a scheme might be. I think you've got to test the temperature first before you start doing work. So,
absolutely.
I mean, what has been done to establish what Londoners think at the moment?
So we did a consultation on the 2018 MTS, which had the road user charging policies within it, and we gathered lots of feedback through that consultation. As you know, we've just consulted again and asked another raft of questions about the future of road user charging in London. And those questions were at a very high level, because I think what's really important is that we did get buy-in to the Mayor's transport strategy and what we're trying to achieve there. And now we need to look at what policies we need to try and deliver that. Part of that might require a new form of road user charging. In order for us to develop that, co-create it with Londoners, make sure that we're doing this in dialogue with people and engaging with people, it was really important for us to ask these questions at an early stage, because we don't have a fully formed scheme. We're not coming out with proposals. What we want to understand from the very outset of our thinking to inform how a future scheme might develop is what people think about it. And we did learn that people, on the whole, thought it was important for a scheme to address the triple challenges. Fairness came across really strongly, and issues that members have already raised about considering things like the other costs of driving, the alternatives available. Road danger came out really strongly. So I think it's been a really valuable exercise for us in trying to understand So I don't disagree at all that we want to get people bought into the policies, but I think we need to remember that the policies are also trying to achieve something. So it's making sure that we are developing policies which deliver the outcomes that people want, and then trying to develop it in a way that responds to their concerns and helps to make sure we kind of develop it in the right way, with their buy-in informed by their feedback as we go through the process.
Thank you. This is actually leading on to my next question, which is what have you done to...
Assemblymember Rogers, there are supplementaries on
apologies.
the previous question.
Okay,
Thank you.
I'll hand back to you then,
People have been putting their hands up, but I'll come back to you in a moment. First of all, Assemblymember Baker.
Thanks, Chair. A quick supplementary, just building on the discussion around about public opinion and consultation and things like that. And just to be clear, I absolutely agree that with such a major change that we do need Londoners on board, and the outcomes are. The wins are really good for them if it works. So that should be possible if it's done right. But this debate is so polarised now, and we're having sort of a very sensible, grounded in reality discussion here, but there are also lots of misinformation out there as well about it. I think Sandeep's been very brave in mentioning 15-minute cities several times. But so, Christina, is this something that's being factored into your thoughts at the moment, and how do we get over this so we can have a real discussion about whether people are going to win or lose, and whether we can do this in a way that benefits Londoners?
So again, I'm going to go back to that consultation, because I think it was really important for us to ask some questions at a completely formative stage, because I think one of the things, you've talked about disinformation, but I think there's also just fear. This is something, anything that's new that people haven't interacted with before, especially when it imposes a cost, is something that makes people nervous. And I think we need to be really kind of clear about that and make sure that we are being very transparent in the way that we are developing it, because I think that any kind of fear that this is being developed behind closed doors doesn't help that public discourse. So what we would really like is to start that engagement at the very earliest stage, to say, right, we've got these challenges, what do you think? What do you think we need to do about them? Is this the right way to go about it? Now, we can take that, the feedback that we've got from that consultation in, we will reflect on it, we'll look at what that means in terms of the next stage. But I think what we really want is an ongoing dialogue. So for us to be able to be really clear with Londoners, this is what we learned from the consultation, this is what we're going to take forward and do next, and this is when we'll come back and speak to you. And of course, we'll always be at a point where if there are firm proposals, there'll be a full public, formal, statutory consultation. But actually, we want much more engagement than just those formal consultation processes. Absolutely. So I think all we can do is keep being clear, sharing information, showing people what we're doing with it, and trying to be really clear about what we're trying to achieve.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, I have two more members want to come in. First of all, Assemblymember Garrett.
Morning. It follows on actually just from the point that Assemblymember Baker was making. So as both a resident and a constituency representative of Outer London for two boroughs of Sutton and Croydon, I live this strange bifurcated life between the conversations and understanding about transport that exists in this building and the conversation and understanding of transport that normal people around me where I live seem to have. And I think in particular, Christina, picking up your point about a vision of the city, I think I would make the fairly obvious point that it's a very diverse city in terms of the kinds of understanding that people have of the kind of place they live and that they want to live in. And my feeling increasingly is that this, the TfL slogan, every journey matters, I think it starts to feel a bit like a sort of ironic comment living where I live, because it seems like TfL's objective is to eliminate quite a lot of the journeys that the people I represent make. And I think picking up on the point that Assemblymember Baker made about cynicism, I think she referred to misinformation and conspiracy theories and so on. Do you think, Christina, that and I agree that there are some of those things, but when you look at the ULEZ consultation that we've just had, I think the perception that people have, which I think is legitimately founded, is that TfL doesn't really understand and doesn't seem very interested in outer London boroughs, particularly boroughs like Sutton and Croydon that don't have tube and don't seem to appear on TfL's radar. And what this will look like, people think that what this will look like is there'll be a new charge for using their car, there will be no new infrastructure, no new opportunities for travel, and you may be aware, I had a discussion with the Mayor on Thursday about whether some of the ULEZ money that's going to be raised in Outer London can be spent in Outer London. And to summarise that discussion, he, I think, has no intention of ring-fencing the money in that way. And so I think what people suspect is that the decision has already been made to implement this, and that whatever consultation happens, or dialogue, as it may be referred to, it's a foregone conclusion, and it's less of an exercise in understanding what people want and more of an exercise in persuading them that what they want is this other thing.
Are you going to ask a question?
I am.
Garrett, thank
so
you.
What would you say, firstly, I mean, can you understand why that approach to consultation generates the concern that I think is obvious in Outer London? And secondly, again, so personally, I check journeys that I'm going to make, like actual journeys that I make. I check them on the City Mapper app. And I also cycle a lot. I have a car which I use, and I check with Waze. It's regularly 2 to 3 times longer journey time by bus than by car or cycle. So what do you think, what would the observation be from TfL's point of view to people who say, well, why would I want to make a journey that lasts or that takes 2 or 3 times longer? And how does TfL think about the implications if people accept that choice and journeys start routinely taking 2 or 3 times longer?
Yeah, so I might take the second part first. So I think in terms of the alternatives available, I think this goes back to kind of what I was saying at the beginning about the scheme being part of a package. It's a part of a suite of policies about how you would try and achieve the MTS, the city that we all want to live in. So I think the package needs to be in place. That you can't have a road user charging scheme by itself and expect that to change everything. So that would mean investment in Outer London, and that's a really key part of the MTS. There would need to be investment in alternatives. But also, as I said, one of the things that you could do with a kind of more sophisticated scheme would be to take account of some of those local circumstances. So if you are in parts of London where there are fewer public transport alternatives, that's something that could be built into the design of a scheme, recognising that people might have different choices depending on their personal circumstances, depending on where they live and public transport accessibility. So I think all of those things can be kind of considered in the development of an appropriate and fit for purpose scheme. And I think part of what informs that, coming on to the other point, is consultation. And consultation exercises are really valuable in us helping us understanding people's views on the impacts of the policies and proposals that we're putting forward. And that was certainly the case with the ULEZ and wider road user charging consultation that we've just run. I think in terms of does this approach to consultation work for people, I think what I'm trying to say is that we wouldn't just be looking at doing a single formal statutory consultation, that there would be multiple rounds of engagement, dialogue, consultation, and as you move through that process, you can see, we can communicate to Londoners how the feedback we've received from them has shaped the next stage of development. And I think that hopefully does demonstrate, shows people, and we've got a period of time now over which we can do that, that actually it's their engagement which is informing the way that any of this work would develop.
I think the cynicism is based on the fact that people think that their response will be ignored, and they think that I asked the Mayor last July what new transport will be available in Sutton and Croydon, and there is none. So that's not really a question, it's an observation, but I think it's very easy to talk in hypothetical terms about what could happen, and I think the cynicism that that Assemblymember Baker mentioned, I think is driven by the fact that people see that when ULEZ arrived, all of the promises sort of dissolved. Thank you, Chair.
I think we shouldn't be arguing about the agenda of the meeting. I will take into account the questions that Assemblymember Garrett...
I'm not discussing the agenda of the meeting.
If you have a question for the panel,
no,
then
I'm
I'd
just
be happy
saying that Assemblymember Garrett has repeatedly referred to my comments and misrepresented my comments.
I
and
believe
I just
you
wanted
did not
that.
say conspiracy theory.
I didn't say conspiracy theorist, and I certainly didn't say that cynicism was based on any consultation. I've been thoroughly misrepresented. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you. Let's not get into that between members of the committee, though. That's very inappropriate.
I think I do apologise. That was my interpretation of what you'd said. I appreciate that that's not what you thought that you'd said.
Thank you very much. Assemblymember Pigeon has a further question.
Thank you. In this discussion, and most of the reports about road pricing and public opinion talk about we've got to raise awareness, to engage the public, influence opinion. But Christina, would TfL consider a trial as part of the development of this to find out the impact on traffic levels and public opinion. If you look, I think in Stockholm back in 2006, they carried out a 7-month trial of a scheme. Massive opposition before it went in, 80% of residents. At the end of it, the majority voted to make the scheme permanent, and they saw that reduction in traffic. Is that one way that you could have people, a mass trial, to see what it meant in reality before the scheme was fully introduced?
Yeah, so we're not at that stage, I don't think. So we don't have any proposals for that now. But I think you're right. That certainly could play a role, and whether that would be trialling a full scheme or you could trial different elements. So I think we would certainly be open to thinking about how you could trial such a thing, but we're not at that point yet. But I'm conscious of that example as well, and it's instructive to see how I think part of what we've talked about is the newness and lack of familiarity and how people don't know or haven't interacted with a scheme like that before, and how you could try and help people understand that. And a trial might be one of the ways you could do that. So it's certainly something that we could consider.
Give real evidence as well, so people could see, actually, I'm only an occasional car user, I'm far better off in this scheme than perhaps somebody who uses it a lot who perhaps wouldn't be.
Yeah.
OK, that's interesting if that's under consideration. The other thing I was thinking is in the 2000s, Sutton Council, and then I think it was going to Richmond, but I'm not sure. I think funding may have then been cut. There was a huge programme, and I can't remember what it was called.
Smarter Travel. Smarter
Travel, working with individuals in those boroughs, looking at the journeys they made and how they could make them in a different way, perhaps using public transport or cycling, walking, and so on. And I remember fantastic adverts actually on the buses, you know, my other car's the bus, really trying to get people to think differently in outer London, and it was very targeted and very successful. Is that the sort of work you would see going hand in hand with any sort of road pricing scheme in the future?
I think that's exactly the point, that we need to be looking at what that whole package would be. So if you had road user charging, which was a kind of enabling part, which would help you prioritise road space or free up road space, which could make journeys quicker and buses quicker, I think what you really need to kind of think about is all of the things that go around it, so that Londoners feel supported in their choices, that they can see that there are alternatives, that they understand that they're there and how to interact with them. And it's not just about putting a pricing mechanism in place and kind of waiting for people to change their behaviour. It's about providing that package in the round. So yeah, I think absolutely those kind of complementary measures would need to be part of the design of anything that you do in future.
Lovely, thank you.
Thank you very much. And just quickly, I was going to mention this later, but it seems to follow on from the question about a trial. In terms of the technology that you use, you are going to be introducing new tolling capacity on the Silvertown and Blackwall tunnels. Does that offer the opportunity to trial technology and get people to, maybe without paying, but model the kinds of amounts they'd pay under different distance-based models, if that makes sense?
I mean, the very short answer is I don't know about how the technology for Silvertown and Blackwall could be kind of play into that. I think kind of separately from the Silvertown element of it, we are looking at the technology and what the best technology is and how we could use that. I haven't. It's not something I've thought about, the potential of looking at whether something could be done in Silvertown. I'm happy to go away and have a think about it.
Excellent. To wave my own party credentials around, a Green Group amendment to the budget last year looked at doing this. So if you would want to have a look at those proposals, that would be quite interesting to look at. Thank you. So now moving back to Assembly Member Rogers for further questions.
Thank you. A question to Christina. Actually, from the question we've had just now, we've seen that TfL have done some work on road user charging. I'm just wondering what have you done to develop plans for road user charging? What kind of stage would you say that you were at?
At a very early stage. So this is something which has been in the MTS since 2018. So there have been kind of people have looked at it over the years. I think where we are now is in the context of the 2030 net zero carbon ambition for 2030, and the work by Element Energy, which has said that we might need a new kind of road user charging by 2030, that we're kind of at a new stage of, okay, we're looking at what this could entail now. And I think, as I say, that consultation was really the first point of which we could kind of set out to people, right, we've got these triple challenges, we've got the 2030 ambition. We've got this piece of work which says that we might be needing a new form of road user charging. Tell us what you think about it. Tell us what you think we should be trying to address with it. Tell us what parameters you think might be important to consider within it. And the stage that we're at now is kind of taking that feedback on board and looking at how we might feed that into objectives, which would help us do optioneering, that kind of work. But we're really at the early stages.
Okay, so you haven't thought about what a scheme might look like, how it might work in practice. It's just the objectives and the high-level parameters for how the scheme would be set up. Is that about correct?
Yeah, I mean, I think in terms of policy, we're thinking about how things would work. I think one of the key challenges that we've set out and been quite clear about is that what we'd like to do is one of the first things you'd want to do is kind of integrate and simplify the charges that are already there. So thinking about how that might work and how you might try and kind of take the congestion charge and LES and ULES and potentially Silvertown and kind of how that might work. So there's thinking that's how it might work kind of logistically, but in policy terms, we're very much at the beginning.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. And then on to Assemblymember Pigeon.
Thank you. I think, Christine, it was also in Boris's transport strategy, it was that I will do all these things, and if they don't work, I will have to look at road user charging. So it has been in Mayor's strategies for many years.
It has always been in them. This one was a little bit more
explicit,
active, yeah.
Exactly. What can you tell us? What are the next steps in the development of a smarter road user charging scheme in London?
So I think there are several elements to it, as I've just kind of alluded to. So there's the technological aspect, so people will be looking at the technology and how that could work in a city like London, which is, as you know, there are cities that have nice grid systems, which is probably a bit easier, but in a complex city like London with very complex journeys, we need to understand how that kind of technology could work in a city like this. There's also a piece of work looking at how you would integrate the existing scheme. So we've got a road user charging landscape already in London. We've got a number of schemes already in place. How do we try and turn them into a single thing without losing any of the benefits of either of them? How can you make that simple and easy for people to understand? So I think a really core part of this is always going to be thinking about the customer, how it works for the customer, and what does it feel like for Londoners, people who need to interact with it. And then in terms of policy, it will be looking at the kinds of policies that we need to reach net zero carbon, to try and look at the road danger reduction, that 80% sustainable mode share. So that's a kind of optioneering, if you like, about looking at how different types of scheme could work. And then you're also thinking about that fairness angle, trying to understand what journeys people are making, at what times of day, what types of trip are they, how switchable are they, what are the alternatives in different parts of London. So there's a huge kind of exercise really in trying to understand the current systems, both in terms of what we've got in place, how people are travelling, what the potential is for change, and how we can try and develop that.
And who's taking the lead for the development of this work? Is it yourself, and which political lead? The mayor, the deputy mayor?
So in terms of kind of accountabilities, if you like, the mayor's obviously set the transport strategy, and it's for TfL then to decide the policies, the things that we need to do to implement their transport strategy. My role is to lead the policy development, but obviously the mayor is the decision maker on a road user charging scheme under Schedule 23. So in terms of policy development, yeah, that sits with me.
And the technology side, the development of the technology, who's leading
so it's all,
on
it
that?
all sits under Alex Williams, the chief.
All under
customer
Alex
and,
Williams. Okay, so he's the lead. And is there a working group? Is the commissioner involved?
So we have a working group. Yes, there are. Sorry, I'm trying to think about my own the meetings that I'm going to. So yes, there is a road user charging steering group, which covers everything. So including things like the ULES, and Alex chairs that meeting. That's probably the key.
Would those minutes be available to us?
I don't see whether I don't know if there are formal minutes from those meetings, but I'm very happy to share those kind of agendas and things like that. And I'll
okay, that would be interesting to see how that's developing. And in terms of the board, is there a subcommittee of the board that's keeping an eye on this?
No.
No, not at the moment. Okay, that's helpful. And what discussions, because clearly we're talking about London here as though we're in a bubble, which we often are in this great city, but actually what discussions are you having with central government? Because that's going to be key to understand where they are on national schemes, and that's constantly the rub. On one hand, I think we had our previous meeting on this, government in some ways want London to lead the way on this, and maybe other regions, as we've heard today. But is that true? What's government thinking on this at the moment?
So, I can't speak for government. I think probably what we've seen is that successive governments have talked about this in some form or other over several years. We've got no active kind of formal discussions with government on it. I think, generally speaking, when it's spoken about in terms of government, it's usually as a replacement for VED or fuel duty, which is quite different from the schemes that we kind of look at in London, where we've got policy objectives and kind of behaviour change objectives. So I think we would try and be cognizant in terms of thinking about any future development about how it might fit within a national picture, but as far as I'm aware, there are no active thoughts in government. I know there was a Transport Select Committee report.
Yes,
I don't think they've responded to that yet.
I'm not aware they are. Steve, are you aware, just you're so connected there, I realise I'm not just saying the politicians, but the civil service obviously have done work on this for some time.
I'm afraid it's a while since I was there, so I don't know what work has been going on within the Department for Transport. I would just observe that, yes, the Transport Select Committee did produce some thinking on this, and I haven't seen a departmental or a government response on that yet.
Okay, lovely. Thank you very much. And just at a very broad level, Christina, what do you see as the next stage for public involvement in this work? What sort of timing for the next stage of public involvement? We'll get into the detail later, but...
Yeah, I don't think I could give you a timing at the moment, because I think that would be kind of to put a deadline on something that is kind of really at its emerging stages. I think what I can do is commit that we would, to very kind of sincerely wanting to continue that public dialogue. But I can't kind of give you a month or a date at the moment.
So not sort of in the next year to go back to the public with something, or you're not even at that sort of broad?
So honestly, I don't have a time scale to give you. I think what we can do as we move through this now will be when I think by the time we got to this consultation, it was really clear that we had these triple challenges. Actually, it was something that we did want to kind of put a stake in the ground, update the MTS, and start to get people's views on that. I think as we kind of progress through the work, I think it'll be clear when we get to another point where actually we've got something helpful to share and to seek feedback on, and when we get to that point, I think we'll absolutely engage, but I don't have a timescale for you, I'm afraid.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much. So now, members, we're moving on to quite a long section about the practicalities of this. There'll be lots of different questions. I'm proposing that we take a comfort break around 11:30, so that'll probably be around about question 10, depending on the number of supplementaries, and we're already about 20 minutes behind, so just to warn you. The number of questions we've got on the briefing do add up to the end of the meeting, so we have to speed up a little bit compared with what we might normally do. So my first question on this is to Christina, and I think you've talked about this somewhat already, but I just wanted to get broadly your view on how the charges for smarter road user charging might differ from the current daily charges. Are you envisaging people paying more or less per day on average, or is your starting point the current daily charge for people who have to pay the ultra low emission zone, for example? And how are you thinking it's going to compare with public transport fares? Are you also looking at those in terms of behaviour change? The difference in fares between each one, I think Michael touched on this earlier, might be a factor in whether you think something might be effective.
Yeah, sorry. So I think that point is really important, the kind of relative pricing between driving and the alternatives. And I think that's something when we're kind of actually getting to a schedule of charges and setting charge levels that will be really important, how you kind of price, especially if you're pricing per mile, how does that kind of compare with taking the same trip by bus or by public transport. So I think absolutely the relationship with public transport fares will be a factor in considering what those charge levels would be. we're not at a stage of having anything like kind of actual charge levels now in terms of telling you the price per day. But I think what you would need to do, and this goes back to that kind of integrating point, is that you don't want to water down the charges that are already there, but equally when you're looking at doing something different, there might be other ways, or the design of those schemes might help you achieve the same thing but in a different way than a daily charge would. So I think that's partly something that we're going to need to understand through the work that we do. Any optioneering and modelling is looking at the way people respond to different types of charges, and what the role in that is of daily charges, or what the role in it is of something like a daily cap. You know, again, going back to a point somebody made earlier about the way people are used to travelling and paying for public transport in terms of zones and daily capping and that kind of thing. So all of that will inform our thinking, but we don't have kind of, we're not at a stage of having prices per day or comparisons like that at this stage.
Yeah, so one thing that concerns me a little bit is the fact that there's currently a strong incentive to change to a cleaner vehicle via what is quite a high, you know, there's a lot of protest about the ultra-low emission zone because it seems like a lot to pay at once. And if you're paying per kilometre to travel instead, potentially the difference per kilometre might be much smaller, be pence instead of pounds. Are you looking at the different incentives for switching vehicles to a safer or a cleaner vehicle, for example, and how those might depend on daily charges as opposed to per mile cut charges?
Yeah, so I think when you look at so one of the things we got back from consultation was when asking people what kind of things should we take account of, we had type of vehicle, time of day, location. Now, all of that's kind of logical and reassuring because they're elements of what we've got in place already. But I think you're right. If you're looking at charging in a different way, it doesn't necessarily have to be underpinned by the same kind of daily charge level that we kind of have in place now. I think also in terms of the ultra low emission zone, given that we are some years away from a future road user charging scheme being in place, that you're actually likely to have such high levels of compliance with the current ULEZ standards that the ULEZ element of it is likely to be much smaller than it would be today by the time you've got kind of future levels of compliance. So I think all of that needs to be kind of considered in the round of what vehicles we're seeing at the time. It's quite hard to preempt too far in the future what charge levels there might be, I think. Sorry if that's not specific enough.
Yeah, no, I wasn't asking about literal charge levels, but the broad structure of things like that. I mean, obviously, yeah, you might get to 100% compliance with ULEZ, but then if you remove the incentive, then there's clearly a loophole for people to bring back, I don't know.
Yeah. So I think it's about not rolling back, isn't it? Yeah. So it's about how we integrate without rolling back. And a new integrated product might look different. So that's where it comes into the quite complex modelling world of trying to understand how people would interact with this, which is something that would part of the reason why it would take quite a long time to develop the right policy, I think.
Okay, great. I'm going to hand over to other members in a moment. But just to pick up on something Assembly Member Pigeon asked earlier on, we're also interested in who you're meeting and talking to about these issues as well, so that maybe as an Assembly we might suggest filling some gaps as well. When you said you would be happy to share the agendas of the meetings, that's really helpful. Is it also the case that we can see sort of consultation and stakeholder meetings that are taking place? In a very broad level, we want to sort of see who's being met and talked to, and that wouldn't necessarily appear in the Mayor's list of meetings or the Deputy Mayor's list of meetings.
So I think in terms of stakeholder engagement, it's probably more part of ongoing, in general discussions. There's no kind of road user charging stakeholder engagement programme that I could point you to.
That's what I mean. Well, it's more casual and just sort of individual meetings. We would quite like to see who has been met and who hasn't yet.
Yeah, okay. I'm sure we can provide information on kind of general stakeholder engagement.
That would be really handy. Thank you very much. Okay, so I'm handing over now to Assembly Member Bailey.
Morning, panel. I'm going to start with TravelWatch, please, and then I might come back to you, Christina. What kind of road users do you feel might pay more under a smarter road user charging system compared with the current scheme, and who might pay less?
I think single occupants in a car, a driver by him or herself, driving at peak times in on the more crowded roads would pay more than now. That would probably tend, given that car ownership tends to be higher at the higher income levels, it would probably be someone at the higher income levels who would be liable for that higher level of charge. And by extrapolation, people who are travelling out of the peak on less congested parts of the network, sharing the car, and therefore potentially sharing the cost, will be paying less. I think there's kind of like an interesting opposite side to this equation, which is that at the moment the combined revenue from congestion charge, LES and ULEZ raises, I think, about £230 million a year to TfL. Moving to a more sophisticated way of charging for road use, where some people pay more and some people pay less according to location, time and type of vehicle, presumably at some point needs to still yield at the very least the same amount of revenue, all other things being equal. Otherwise there will be a hole in the finances, and that potentially has then a consequence, not least in terms of investing in the alternatives, which we have said in one way or another are so important to making this thing not only work but be acceptable to Londoners.
But if London goes ahead with its own scheme, doesn't it just mean all Londoners who drive at all, and car ownership is higher at the higher income levels, of course, but it goes quite far down into the lower income levels. So doesn't it just mean all Londoners will pay more, because we'll still have to address whatever charging scheme the rest of the country has? The Mayor has absolutely no power to suggest that vehicle VAD goes away, so it will be an addition to car ownership costs, surely.
That sounds logical. I suppose that would be the case for those people who don't make a decision to change their mode of transport to another form of transport, where that alternative is available to them, point one. And point two, it depends on the extent to which any new scheme brings in a system of discounts or allowances or lower charges for certain categories of road user in recognition of the impact that charging would bring to them.
Okay, but any discount is not a discount if it's small. So I, as a Londoner, I'd still have to pay all my requisite road user charging, tax, etc., to own that car and use that car in the rest of the country. So any addition to that is an addition, and maybe I should direct this at TfL. So I can't see how a scheme doesn't just cost Londoners more. This sounds like an inflationary pressure on existing in London.
So I think it goes back to the objective of a scheme and what it would be trying to achieve. And so if a scheme enables people to shift modes such that they don't need to own a car, perhaps, not everybody, but for some people they may no longer need to own a car. And I think we saw that through the ULEZ scrappage scheme for the car and motorcycle scheme. A third of people didn't buy replacement cars, and actually that reduces an ongoing ownership of car cost. And so I think there are different ways that this could impact Londoners. Of course, not all of them own cars either, so this could help to make their journeys better. So I don't think it's the case that every Londoner would pay new road user charges. Any charges which would be in place in London, in the same way as the congestion charge and ULEZ are today, are for policy objectives, so they're not the same costs, if you like, they're not charges for the same purposes as tax, as VED. And they exist on top of VED now because they are trying to address particular challenges in London, and that would be the same with any potential future road user charge. So for people who did keep their vehicles and needed to continue to drive, there would be a cost for those journeys, but there would also be a benefit to them for those journeys. Some people may need to drive less or may not need to drive at all, which might also have a kind of balancing cost. So I think it's something that we'd need to look at in a lot more detail. We would, of course, do full impact assessments to really understand what those impacts would be and identify any mitigations.
I see your point. I don't agree, because many people who exist in London with a car don't pay any of those charges because their car's compliant or they don't drive inside the zone, but they will have to pay those charges a charge of some type if this system was brought in, because any road in London would then be charged at some point.
So again, I think it's really important to say that we don't have proposals now. We don't have proposals for a scheme or what it would mean in different areas. There are no current scheme proposals. At a point where we would have scheme proposals and you could understand better what it meant in different areas, different times of day for different vehicles, that's when we'd be able to do an impact assessment and understand what they are. But I don't think we could say that now because we don't have scheme proposals now.
Yeah, I understand. I only make the point because this entire conversation, maybe this is the way the chair suggested, seems to be this should be done and we're just working through the detail. But I still think we need to come back to the very beginning thing of this can't be done by London. It needs to be done.
Assembly Member Bailey, you're correct. That question isn't within the scope of the investigation. We're just seeking evidence today, not trying to come to a conclusion or convince each other.
We do this organisation down in GLA if we don't provide challenge to any idea that we discuss. We should be providing challenge. It's up to us to provide some of that challenge.
Very happy for you to ask practical questions, Assembly Member Bailey.
I just, that's my problem. Yeah. Where are we? What? This is to all of the panel, so please feel free to come in. What different cost structures would be needed for different scheme options for the future of road charger scheme? So this to me sounds very complicated. Christina made a comment that this is about policy objectives, but what different pricing schemes would be needed to do that? Because some of these things in here are very complicated. And one thing that TfL has been very expert with the Oyster cards is simplification, and everybody's accepted it. But this sounds like it would be the complete opposite. Because if you're going to offer reductions for some people, it's going to measure the distance you drive, the time you drive. That seems very, very complicated. So what type of charging scheme do you think would satisfy any or all of those policy objectives?
I think just briefly on the kind of Oyster point, I think it doesn't, that's complicated in the background as well, because you've got discounts within that, you've got distance travelled within that, you've got time of day within that, you've got different modes within that. So I think it is fairly analogous actually, that it's simple for somebody to use because the user interface and the customer experience is such that they have confidence in the system that those things sit behind it and that they will be charged the right amount. And I think that's the kind of customer experience that you'd be looking to replicate, where there are those complexities in the background about time of day and which mode or which vehicle, distance, location. But actually, for the user, once you've got confidence in that system, it should be an analogous experience, I think, to the Oyster one. So that I just
you're correct, and I make the point because Oyster can track you. And I know there's other questions about that, but Oyster could quite easily track you. You enter the zone, and every time you tap in that, Oyster tracks you. That's going to be very hard to achieve on our entire road network. That's why I make that point.
Yeah, and I think that goes back to the technology and why the technology is probably some way from being ready in a city like London, because it would be challenging to understand, make sure that we could be certain that the journeys were being calculated in the right way.
I'm sure some of my colleagues will come to technology, but what sort of pricing scheme, again, maybe somebody else would like to make a contribution to that?
Thank you. Difficult to comment exactly on the scheme because we're not talking about a concrete proposal yet on the table, but just giving our experience of the work that we did in the West Midlands. And some of this does come back down to, one, identifying your policy goals and what is it that you're trying to achieve, and then what is that price elasticity in terms of what sort of pricing level helps you obtain those policy objectives. But then it's also about understanding the positive impacts and the negative impacts of that. Obviously, you would probably hit a lot of your policy goals if you went right through with the road user charging scheme in terms of achieving better environmental outcomes, cleaner air, reducing congestion. But then what are the negative impacts in terms of what does it do to residents in a certain area? What does it do to some of those inequality and fairness points that we've spoken about before? So a lot of that only comes out of the more detailed work, and particularly modelling, and for those transport planners, this is less of a science and more of a dark art probably, in terms of trying to determine what people will do and modelling that behaviour change that will happen. And it's a very complicated thing to do, and we can only go off a range of technical impacts and technical work alongside qualitative assessments of opinions, what research, what are people likely to do. But all of those things would be instrumental in setting that pricing level. The other thing you need to take into account is what does that system actually cost you to run and operate, because that's obviously got to come out of the revenues that you generate, and overall, is there still a benefit for doing something as opposed to not doing something? So those were the sort of steps that we went through when we were looking at road user pricing and looking at what would be the optimal levels. So if we're going out to consult and engage with the public and businesses and residents, really thinking about, well, this would be the charge, this is the likely impact, and being able to then sort of gauge those views around that. But that's our experience of the work that we did a number of years ago.
I think that there's the immense complexity which Christina and her colleagues would have to engage in what the level of this combined charge would be to reflect all of these difficult things that Transport for London or whoever are trying to wrestle with. And then the task is, exactly as you picked up, how do you translate that into something that is as easy for users to understand as the cost of using public transport in London? And I think they're two tasks in a way. One is, yes, that's incredibly complicated, and speaking as someone who's tried to work out why their gas bill is what it is, it's incredibly complicated, but ultimately it costs you that much for a therm, and a therm heats your house for this long. So it's, can they come up with something, could anybody come up with something that is comprehensible? Because if it fails that test, the most complex system in the world could be economically brilliant, but it's not going to fly with the public.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. One tiny... The other thing that's interesting to me, we talk about London. Of course, anybody who lives there knows it's very different in the centre. There's many more alternatives. Many Londoners in the centre of London don't own a car because, quite frankly, it's unnecessary. Whereas if you go out to, if you live in Biggin Hill or Upminster, if you don't have a car, you don't have a life, is what locals say to me. Is there any opportunity? Could somebody who lived out in Biggin Hill, let's say, hardly any congestion at all, very low, very high air quality, is there an opportunity for those people to pay considerably less, or maybe even nothing at all?
So I think this goes back to the design of the scheme and taking account of local circumstances. So I think that the availability of alternatives is one of the things that I think has come up that would need to be considered in setting of a charge level. So a short answer in terms of could that be taken into account is yes. Exactly the mechanics of how we do that, as Steve said, it's going to be complicated to try and work that out. But yeah, in principle, absolutely. But the other thing I think I'd say is that we don't want it to be the case, and I don't think it is the case. It's not that everybody in outer London owns the car, that you can't move around if you haven't got a car. But actually what we want to do is make sure that the alternatives are there. And I think, again, that goes back to part of this wider package, making sure you've got the right complementary measures and that we're delivering the whole piece. It's not just about, it wouldn't just be about a road user charging.
Because there'll be a challenge in any consultation, because there's a principle there. Does everybody pay something, or could some people pay nothing at all? I think would be almost a moral challenge to that.
And I think that's something that would need to be considered in the development of the scheme.
Okay, Chair, back to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. A couple of members want to come in with further questions. We've got Assemblymember Garrett and then Assemblymember Baker.
Yeah, it's actually just following on from the discussion we've just had and with Assemblymember Bailey, and this question about the sort of analogy, if you like, between road user charge and like an oyster charge or public transport charge. And I was, I think, struck in particular, and this struck me thinking about this before, Steve, by your point about the conflict between complexity versus, in particular, I think the objective of tackling congestion. And it seemed to me that if you actually want to use a scheme like this to tackle congestion, you probably need something like, the surge pricing that Uber or other taxi apps have, where, at some point the price just rockets up significantly. And I'm not an Uber user, but I'm conscious that caused them a lot of PR difficulties. So I just wonder, I mean, I guess Steve or maybe anyone else, am I right in thinking that if you actually want to use this to tackle congestion, as opposed to the other things we've talked about, the pricing scheme probably does have to have something like that in it, where either there's a very acute increase either in a particular place or at a particular time in a particular place, Otherwise, there's no deterrent. But then if you have that, the complexity sort of spirals out of control. Is that a sort of fair assessment of the challenge? Steve,
Yeah,
yes.
Sorry, yes, I'm very happy to come in on that. So I would say the short answer is, I think, yes, that is a fair assessment. I think that traditionally we think about a road user charging as being about time, distance and place. And so the questions that we'd be asking of the designers is, if we wish not to have congestion, when is it occurring? I think what we're contemplating here, though, is thinking, well, if congestion is occurring traditionally in the peak, in the morning, say, and we don't want that to happen, there's also a question about, well, do you want to move those trips to a different time of day? If you move the trips to a different time of day, that's not doing anything for your tailpipe emissions. That's all day long. So I might have achieved one outcome by delaying my start of work to 10:30 in the morning instead of 8 o'clock in the morning, but I'm still adding to the air quality problem. So when you're combining those things, you've got to really think, let's take a step back. What is it we're trying to achieve here? And to pick up the point that Assembly Member Bailey was saying, and is it credible that the people we're trying to influence actually have the sort of choices that we're inviting them to make? Because ultimately, if say, my choice is I need to be at a particular place of employment at a particular time of day, and my employer's view is, tough, be there at this time of day, that's when we're opening up, and I want you there at that time, my choices might be quite limited, whereas for many of us, formerly office workers, we have the luxury at the moment of perhaps being able to work from home and not making the trip at all. So I think being very clear about what's the influence that you're trying to have, and is that influence actually achievable in the real world? It's where the wonders of economics meet the brutality of the real world that the problems arise.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's one of the reasons that leads me, I think your answer and thinking about that leads me to think that probably that aspect of the scheme is probably the bit that gets dropped in favour of other objectives. Just if I can ask you, Christina, because obviously TfL currently has, in inverted commas, surge pricing. So if I get a train, as I did this morning, at a peak time, I pay more than if I came in at, say, 11 o'clock, which wouldn't have been very useful for this meeting. And it seemed to me that although that was maybe acting as some sort of deterrent, it was standing room only on my train, so it wasn't much of one, because the price differential is quite small between coming in at, the 7:30 train I got versus, say, a 9:30 train. So is this something that TfL have looked at, both the practicalities and the sort of the PR, if you like, of having a very starkly differentiated costs at different times or different places?
So I think I'm going to make a terminology point now, which might not actually be correct because I'm not an expert in this, but I think the difference between like peak pricing, which is set and people know when it is, and that encourages people that if they don't need to travel at that time of day, then they are incentivised to avoid it because it's the busiest, and that's kind of reflected in the price. I think that's different from surge pricing, which is more dynamic and kind of is, I think, going to points people have already made, it's much more difficult for people to plan their trips around things like surge pricing. And I think that's something that would need to be really kind of central to thinking about a scheme, because again, I think that going back to that kind of customer-centric point and people knowing how to interact with it, I think a journey which cost you £3 yesterday but costs you £5 the next day is going to be very difficult to plan for. So I think that dynamic surge pricing presents those challenges, but I think that's different from a peak and off-peak at the times of day when you know are kind of consistently busiest, which is more of a kind of congestion charge type model. So I think charging by time of day makes sense in areas where you have particular congestion at time of day, but I think that would vary according to different parts of London with different conditions. So I think probably fixed peak pricing makes more sense to me at this point than something that's very dynamic and very changeable. But that's me. That's an answer rather than reflecting again any kind of proposals or.
Yeah, I just want to, because you're right. Some forms of congestion are predictable. Some forms are unpredictable, and something happens. Maybe an accident happens and creates congestion. So you're not thinking about it in the second case scenario where you haven't done any work in terms of in that scenario where there's a sort of acute congestion as opposed to chronic congestion, if I can put it that way.
Yes, so that's not something that I'm kind of considering or looking at the moment. But as I say, we're at the very early stages. But I think for me, I think that customer-centric point is really important, and I think that kind of unpredictable element would be difficult for customers.
Okay, my final question though on again this analogy between public transport fares and a road user charge. So as I mentioned, my train was quite busy this morning, probably not the only one. Nobody says, oh, the train was really busy this morning, we need to put the prices up to deter some people, even though in a very rough sense that is the purpose of a peak time fare. Nobody actually says, oh, the trains are very busy, we need to keep putting prices up until they're not busy. But with road pricing, that is actually the objective. The objective is to set the price at a point where it deters people, because that's part of the Mayor's transport strategy. So, so that, is that correct? That if you brought this in and it didn't really deter very many people, the price would have to keep going up until it did deter enough people, as per the traffic reduction targets in the Mayor's transport strategy?
So I think the point would be, and this goes back to this kind of very first principles, is like trying to understand what we want to achieve with a scheme. Now, if what we want to achieve with a scheme is reduced road danger, which, as Steve said, reduced traffic leads you to lower levels of road danger, fewer interactions with vulnerable road users and cars. If what we're trying to achieve is more reliable buses, which means that they are less kind of stuck in traffic and congestion, then you will be looking for a certain level of behaviour change. And I think that goes back again to looking at the whole package. So what alternatives have we got in place? How are they priced? What's the road pricing in relation to that? But I think you need to look at the whole thing and how it works together, because you would be setting a price to achieve a certain amount of behaviour change, and that could be different at different times of day. It could be about the emissions of a vehicle, it could be about traffic reduction. So a charge would need to be set to deliver benefits, because otherwise it would just be revenue raising, and we need to see those policy benefits. That's the point of introducing a scheme.
But one of the policy benefits is to reduce the number of vehicles. So if you brought the charge in, regardless of whether it raised revenue, let's assume it would, if regardless of whether it raised revenue, if it didn't reduce the number of vehicles by a substantial amount that the Mayor's targeting, then it would not have achieved that objective.
Well, so I don't think there's there's no substantial figure at the moment that we'd be trying to achieve simply with a charge. So I think there would be a suite of policies that would be trying to achieve that traffic reduction. A charge could be a part of that. It wouldn't necessarily be looking to achieve the entire target by itself, which is why we need to understand what the scheme would be trying to achieve. It wouldn't be a scheme which is trying to deliver the MTS single-handedly. There would be a wider suite of policies to set alongside it.
Okay. And finally, can I just make the very short observation that when I'm cycling along and there's a lot of congestion, that is less of a danger to me than fast-flowing traffic. And so actually eliminating congestion is contrary, in some cases, to the objective of road safety. That's my observation as a cyclist.
I think it's about how you use the road space. So if it's about making sure that the road network works efficiently, but also there might be more space for people walking or cycling or for buses, then it means that everything can move more efficiently, but you're not necessarily having...
Sure, but I think there's a tendency just to say good things are good and bad things are bad, and road safety is good and, congestion is bad. But actually, congestion contributes to road safety. For me personally, when I'm cycling across Tower Bridge this morning, traffic was a standstill, zero danger, because I was going faster than they were. I just make that observation.
I think there are other ways to provide safety. I don't think it has to be congestion.
Okay. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much. I have Assembly Member Baker now with a supplementary. Then I would like to come in, and then Assemblymember Prince has asked to come in. So after that has happened, before we move on to your substantive question, Assemblymember Prince, we will take a comfort break. So just to warn you.
Thank you, Chair. I've got a supplementary on what I think is a pretty big subject, but we don't have very much time. So, and I think we keep talking around it, which is journey purpose. Because what Michael said earlier on, who would we expect to end up paying more? People who are on their own in a car, peak times, congested roads. Now, some of those people are going to be have to drive for purposes that are actually pretty useful for London. For instance, an emergency plumber. They're probably on their own. They have to drive because they've got a load of stuff in the back, and they can't have an option. And I think some of this. The blunt instrument that doesn't acknowledge the value to London for different types of trips, I think, is a real barrier. And I know it's not an easy thing to tackle. But we also have home care workers who don't have a choice to drive. They have to drive because otherwise they're not going to be able to do their job. So I know it's a subset. It's not everyone, but is there a way of incorporating something that recognises the journey purposes and the value of those journeys and the need to make those journeys in a charging scheme? Stephen?
I'd just say in principle, yes, and in practice, very, very difficult, keeping it short.
Yeah.
And I think, yes, I think in terms of the principle, it's definitely something that you look to build in. And I think complexity seems to be the watchword of the day. It's not simple, but I think absolutely recognising that there are people who really need to make essential trips, and some people who may be more reliant on vehicles than others will be really part of making good policy. It doesn't mean that it's going to be easy to do, but I think it's really critical to our thinking that you need to consider the people who need to make journeys. The journeys, there is essential traffic. There are people who are more reliant on vehicles and less able to switch. And I think those things need to be kind of really fundamental to the development. And that's something that we heard from consultation as well, that fairness element and making sure that that is really kind of core to thinking from the outset of a scheme. And that's what we will try to do.
Thank you. Yep, thanks. I think we'll come back to that.
Thank you. So I just wanted to ask, and maybe you can answer in writing, I think this is a question to Steve, because we did ask questions at the last meeting to our guests. Do you have any information or research that you can point us to about elasticities in driving in relation to costs? So what I mean is, when the cost goes up by so much, does it cut driving by this much? And I wonder if you might share with us what you know about that. And I would probably want to try and find information on deliberate changes to prices as opposed to things like variations in fuel costs, which do vary with the weather, more or less.
So we don't have anything in the RAC Foundation that has elasticities of response to prices, certainly not in the time that I've been there. So the most recent that I'm confident of go back quite a long way, because there were elasticities built into the work that I was responsible for back in the early 2000s, back in the Department for Transport, and I'd be a bit dubious of pointing you towards them, because with 20 years passing, it's very hard to say. What I would say on the subject of those elasticities, though, is I'll just illustrate it with a rather silly example. I didn't think I was going to be hugely swayed by a 5p or 10p charge on something. And yet when I go to the supermarket, I watch people tottering out with an armful of groceries because they don't want to pay 10p for a bag, but they would risk dropping a £5 bottle of wine or something rather than pay 10p for a bag. So some quite small prices can have quite an effect on people, but I'd be actually quite suspicious of a table of elasticities that was generally about how our driver's going to respond, when I think there's quite a difference between how people might respond in Biggin Hill as opposed to, say, Tower Hill. So I'm afraid I can't point you to anything. I will go away and check with my colleagues in case they've got something they can point us towards, but I think it's not quite as precise a science as some of my economic colleagues might think.
Thank you very much. We had a meeting on fares at our last meeting, and Transport for London were very clear at that point that they had very strict knowledge of how fare changes affected ridership. So I wondered, Transport for London, are you doing some experiments into this, or will this depend on when you can get to trial the technology in some ways?
So I think probably we've learned a lot from schemes like the congestion charge and the ULEZ. We've got a lot of monitoring reports that show how those, so the congestion charge obviously has been in place since 2003. There have been price rises where you can see how traffic has responded to those in a series of monitoring reports. So I think we do know that, but I think it's going back to other points which have been raised this morning about where people live, what their jobs are, how able they are to change those journeys. And I think that's something which is more complex and will need to be some of that we will need to learn through future work and future modelling and engagement with stakeholders to understand what they think they might be able to do or might do in response to certain types of charging. But I think the best information we have in terms of how road users or drivers respond to charges is through the monitoring of the schemes we've already got in place.
Okay, thank you very much. And over to Assembly Member Prince.
Thank you, Chair. Question for Christina, but Steve, you might want to come in. You both mentioned about roads being safer with fewer cars on them, and I think my colleague touched on the point I was going to make. But the evidence showed that during lockdown, there was a very significant reduction in the number of motorcyclist deaths, which we would argue was because there was more road space for motorcyclists who are losing space every year. But there was no real decrease in push bike deaths. In fact, I think it actually went up because there were more people using their push bikes. So how would road pricing actually add to the road safety agenda if it had that negative effect on probably the most vulnerable road users, which are push bike riders?
So I think there are quite a few things in there, and I think those the casualty figures, as you said, there were so many more people cycling. They need to look at the kind of the proportions of that as well. But there is quite a big difference between a kind of managed road user charging scheme, which could be designed, put into place with the appropriate investment alongside it and complementary measures, versus the streets kind of emptying because of people kind of being locked down, and therefore having emptier streets and higher speeds with a lack of the usual types of traffic. So I think the first thing, I don't think that's probably the right proxy for how a road user charging scheme would work, which would be more about trying to make the most efficient use of road space. And actually, if you had less traffic on roads and you could have more space for more vulnerable road users, with more space for things like bus priority, then I think you are able to create a safer environment for everybody, with fewer interactions between those more vulnerable road users and car users. And I don't think that's quite the same as the kind of empty streets during lockdown, during which times there were more people kind of out on streets, probably unaccustomed to it, and vehicles that were able to drive more quickly because of the lack of traffic.
Before, Steve, I don't know if you want to come in, but just before you do, on that, any road pricing scheme that you've looked at, would that include motorcycles?
So I think this goes back to the kind of scheme design. So again, looking at which vehicles would pay at what times of day. So I think that's part of what's in the mix, which vehicles pay. As you know, it's different in the congestion charge and ULEZ. So again, it's looking at how you integrate those schemes and what the right way of designing that would be. So that would be which vehicles would pay and would pay what charge levels would be part of a design, but we're not at that point yet.
And that would be based on policy goals, would it? So if the policy goal was 1, to reduce pollution, 2, to reduce congestion, clearly a motorcycle wouldn't add to congestion, but it might add to pollution.
And safety. So I think it goes back to what are the objectives of the scheme, and how would that all kind of tie in together. So I don't have. You're right that yes, it would depend on how you design a scheme to achieve those objectives, and we're not at that point yet.
Thank you. Steve, did you want?
Well, speaking as someone who's a motorcyclist and very occasional cyclist, I confess, I think if I take you back to what I said about the way that road pricing or road user charging is generally thought about as a time, distance, place thing. So it's about what time are you using the network and whereabouts are you using the network and how far are you going on it. None of those really go to, and how are you using it in terms of how are you behaving? What's your driver behaviour? And that leads me to think that I probably wouldn't think of road user charging as a principal tool or lever for achieving a road safety outcome. I would say maybe there's something there if you're thinking, as Christina has said, about the volume and the mix of traffic. But I suspect it's much more about some of the other things that you can more readily see a relationship with, which, as you said, if you're riding a motorcycle and you're riding a relatively recent one, a Euro 4, then your environmental impact, your tailpipe emissions are going to be lower, so that's a good thing. Some of the older bikes, not so good, but in terms of the total traffic mix, probably not the first thing you'd worry about if you were trying to improve the air quality generally across the city.
You're not decrying the good old two-stroke, are you?
I gave up my good old two-stroke and I have a nice Euro 4.
Okay, thank you very much. Really useful to ask some questions about motorcycles there. Thank you. So before we carry on with questions, I'm going to call for a comfort break now and adjourn the meeting for got. I'll give it 10 minutes just so that we can all queue for the loo and everything. So coming back at 11:55. Thank you. Cheers. Okay, members and guests, welcome back to the London Assembly Transport Committee. Since we adjourned, we've gained some members of the audience from Chingford C of E Primary School, I understand. Thank you very much for coming. We're the London Assembly Transport Committee. We're looking at the potential for smarter charging for road use, and we have some guests here from Transport for London, from the West Midlands, from TravelWatch, and from the RAC Foundation that we're asking questions to. So I'm going to hand questions back now to Assembly Member Prince to start with a question.
Thank you, Chair. Again, if I could speak to you, Christina, if that's all right. So, as you know, you're building, or someone's building the new Silvertown tunnel, and the premise of that is that it's almost like pay as you go. So it's going to have a toll on it, like PFI, and the question would be as well, that not only does that get tolled to pay for it, also Blackwall Tunnel is being tolled as well, which currently is free. There's two questions really. Will those tolls continue after the payment has been made for the Silvertown Tunnel? And if before that event happened, would those tolls be merged into any kind of road charging scheme?
Yeah, sure. So as you've referenced, the charges for Silvertown and Blackwall are kind of for a specific purpose to meet the needs of those schemes. I think the integration point probably goes back to actually how we do it, how it could be done in the background, even if those things couldn't be fully integrated, whether you could actually make it integrated essentially from a customer perspective. Because I think in an ideal world, the fewer different things that you need to interact with, the better. So I think from a customer experience point of view, it would certainly be preferable to integrate them, even if because of the slightly different nature of those charges and what their purpose is in those schemes, they couldn't be kind of fully absorbed in the background, if you like.
Actually, you've just made me think of another question, actually. At the moment, my car's registered to pay for congestion charge and or ULEZ. Would the same system be used to pay for the tolling on the Silvertown Tunnel?
I'd need to check that, actually. Whether they would be kind of automatically deducted from the road user charging account, you mean, in the same way?
Yeah. Do you not think they should be?
Yeah, so I think that's what I'm saying. I think from a customer perspective, that full integration is definitely what we should be aiming for. I would think they probably would be now anyway, but I would just want to come back and confirm that with you.
And sorry to just go off course a bit. We had the fiasco of the Hammersmith Bridge last year, as you probably know. Has any consideration been given to tolling all the crossings in London to build up a fund to prevent that in the future, and also to reduce the persecution of people who live in East London?
Yes, we've got no proposals at the moment to toll all river crossings.
But have you considered it?
So I think it's one of the...
Or should you not consider it?
Have you considered it? Should you not consider it? So I think looking at the road user charging piece as a whole, you would consider river crossings within that. I think just looking at charging solely the river crossings is not something that we're currently looking at.
But do you not think you should look at it?
Yeah, sure. I can come back to you on that. I'm thinking about Hammersmith and particularly the role of Hammersmith and Fulham on that bridge. I don't know if it's.
Yeah, they do own the bridge. I'm happy to have a conversation with you offline, actually,
yeah,
rather
sure.
than But
happy to follow up on river crossings.
There is some mileage in looking at building up a fund so we don't get another Hammersmith.
Yeah, I think that the ownership probably of the bridges makes that more complex. But we can definitely talk about follow up on how we might look at longevity and sustainability of river crossings. Sure.
Okay, yes, thank you. And any information you have would be useful on that. I know the committee before has looked at the river crossings issue and how they're paid for, so it might be something we think about recommendations for in future. Right, so moving on to Assembly Member Pidgeon.
Yeah, could I pick up with you, Christina? Has TfL had any conversations with government, probably it would be the Treasury, I'm imagining, about smarter road user charging replacing current VED, fuel duty, insurance premium tax?
So no, we've got no discussions with Treasury about RUC at the moment.
What about as part of any of the financial settlements that TfL has received over the last few years? Have there been any discussions that you're aware of?
Not that I'm aware of, no.
Okay. Do you anticipate any new smarter road user charging system to exist alongside the 3 charges or to replace them?
By the 3 charges, do you mean the
VED,
okay.
fuel duty, insurance premium tax?
Yeah, so I think I alluded to this earlier that successive governments have talked about the potential to replace VED and fuel duty, certainly. As I'm aware at the moment, there are no plans for them to progress that, but I couldn't speak to what their kind of internal
thinking would be. So you're assuming that any scheme that might come in London would have to sit alongside these?
Yes, and I think as is the case currently, that we have road user charging schemes in London that sit alongside VED and fuel duty because they're there for different purposes. They're there to manage congestion and reduce emissions. And I think that would again be key to the fact that any scheme that you'd have in London would be to achieve policy-based objectives to address London-specific challenges and would be separate from road taxation, essentially.
But I think for the user, they might see it as fairer if it was replacing other taxation and was far more based on how much you use your vehicle. Have you looked, and will you be, or if not, will you be looking at any examples of fuel duty being replaced successfully internationally? I think it was done in Oregon, and obviously a different structure there and so on, but they used it, I think, successfully. Will you be looking at that?
So, as you know, we don't have control of VED in London, although that is something that we have spoken to government about in the past. I think if you did have control over VED in London, that would give you kind of another element to look at to see how you could balance those different costs of driving. That's not the case as it stands at the moment, and I think so the best that we can do in terms of policy development is, again, this is something that we heard out of that consultation, is making sure that we're considering the other costs of driving in the development of a scheme, and going to your point about customer kind of fairness and feeling like that they can see what these different charges are there for and what the benefits are of them. I think that's a key part of what we'd need to do in London.
Will you be looking to start having conversations with government at some point as you start developing your thinking in this area? Because it seems to me that you need to kind of understand where thinking is going centrally to see how this could sit aside it or be a pilot for the country or whatever it might be.
Yeah, so I think we'd be really happy to have those discussions with government if they've got plans that they want to share with us and discuss.
Okay, thank you.
Great. I had a supplementary note noted from Assembly Member Rogers.
Yes, I think just briefly. Assemblymember Pigeon touched on the notion of fairness, and I think it goes back to what we were discussing before about public opinion and people's views on these sorts of schemes. And do you think that, regardless of the objectives of the different charges, that Londoners would view a road user charging system which left in place VED, fuel tax, insurance premium tax, as a fair one?
So I think, again, that would not be a kind of new scenario. So at the moment, it is the case that there are road user charges in London which sit alongside VED and fuel duty. And I think the fairness of that is about looking at the challenges that exist in London, that those schemes are there to address, and the benefits that they are providing to Londoners, which is separate from their VED and fuel duty. So the revenues that are raised from London schemes all go back into achieving the objectives of the MTS and provide benefits to Londoners. So I think the fairness issue is about how well we can structure the scheme to deliver the outcomes that we're looking to deliver in a fair and balanced way for Londoners that takes account of impacts. I don't think the existence of VED necessarily undermines that, although I acknowledge that if we had control of London's VED, that would be something that we would be able to consider in a kind of more integrated way, but that's not the case at the moment.
Okay, so your sort of contention is that it depends on the design of the scheme and how you communicate that objectives. And I suppose that all goes back to how you engage with Londoners in the first instance on this, and also the confidence that Londoners have that that engagement will be robust and meaningful.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Thank you, Chair.
Great. And then I think Assembly Member Bailey.
Thank you, Chair. Tried to be quick. Did you say insurance, car insurance, would also be taken over?
Insurance premium tax.
Exists at the moment, John.
Oh, no, I just wonder, are you saying that we take on the liability for people's insured car? That's
specific
no,
tax,
just
insurance
the tax.
premium tax.
Thank you. I just wanted to clear that up.
Thank you very much. Right, handing over to Assembly Member Sheikh.
Thank you. Good afternoon to the panel. It's good to hear from you. I think we've sort of had quite a few different questions put to the panel and tried to ascertain how there might be variation in charges based on the different sort of priority factors, be that distance, time, location, air pollution, etc. So as much as I wanted to put it back to TfL if they had any clarity on how they might prioritise the variation in charges of that, I do think that has been answered. So I just wanted to give you one opportunity to clarify that.
Yeah, I think there's probably not a great deal more I can say on it other than that we will be taking account of those multiple objectives.
We are excited and wait with bated breath. So I think what I'll do instead is I just want to hone in on this particular question, which I think has been raised by the panel, by the committee, which is, obviously as a Londoner, if you're living in an area with public transport accessibility level where it's low versus places where you can more easily hop on a train or a tube and the frequency of that is quicker, how can we ensure that any scheme that does come in, that those in those areas who have a low PTAL, that they are still able to make a journey in an affordable way in a car rather than being priced out of that journey? So I'll put that to you, Christina.
Yeah, sure. And I think we've probably touched on this as well, but it's really about looking at what those local circumstances are, and I think that's something that we really do want to take account of. So again, going back to this kind of core fairness and customer, you need to be able to see that there is an alternative there. So part of that is about the package of measures that could accompany a charge, and that would be about investment in public transport and sustainable alternatives. So putting those alternatives in place, but where those alternatives are less or are fewer, acknowledging that and making sure that a pricing system kind of is fairly designed such that it's not disproportionately disadvantaging people who don't have access to those alternatives.
Yeah, so obviously, although you can't commit to it, you do anticipate that acknowledging that disparity would be reflected in the pricing system.
Yeah, I think it would be really important to acknowledge the availability of alternatives.
Okay, fantastic. And I think sort of building on the points that members have made, I think especially in the engagement around any potential future schemes, making sure that's really emphasised so that people are aware that they wouldn't be disadvantaged would be crucial. Okay, next question. So what technology could be used to support any future scheme, and what kind of investment would be needed by TfL, London Boroughs, government and road users? And I'll start with you, Christina, but it'd be good to hear from anyone else on the panel.
So I think in terms of technology, that's something that we are looking at now. We know that there are technologies out there that would help to deliver something like this, but again, it's looking at testing that, making sure that it would be robust, understanding how it could work in a city like London. I think from the work that we've done, we think that's some years away from being ready to implement in a city like London. In terms of levels of investment, I'm afraid I don't have an answer for you there. I think that's something that we'll need to kind of continue to look at and work through as we develop proposals and understand what the technology would actually need to deliver. But yeah, that's something that will be kind of part of the work that we need to do going forward.
Yeah, except that it might be a few years before it's able to be implemented in London, but you have referred to there being technologies out there, so I was wondering if you could give some examples or best practice of other cities where it's being used so that we could get a sense of what we might be anticipating.
Yeah, so Singapore is often cited as an example of someone who's done more kind of dynamic pricing, and they do have pricing which varies more frequently kind of according to local conditions, but they've also not yet moved to a full kind of pay per mile scheme. So I think this isn't something, the Oregon example's been referred to. There are some American cities who have looked at doing something similar. That's different again because of kind of federal and state differentiations with taxes that we don't have. So there isn't somewhere that's doing this really already in the way that we'd be looking at. So it's untested and we would be doing it for the first time, which I think, again, adds to that complexity, and unfortunately means that I don't have really clear answers for you, because it's something that we'll need to do a lot of work on to try and establish how that might be implementable in London.
Okay, thank you. I don't know if anyone else on the panel wanted to point to best practice or give examples of sort of specific technologies. I mean, Christina, it was helpful to hear Singapore cited, but I don't want to get too technical, but I guess a little bit more understanding of what that tech actually looks like, and sort of like putting some names to equipment, branding, the companies running it, that sort of thing I think would be helpful to kind of begin to build a picture. Please, Steve.
What I'd say is, if you look at charging schemes around the world, I don't think I'm aware of any of them that do anything more sophisticated at the moment than offer different ways of testing whether you've gone past a sensor of some sort. So, for example, having a dart tag, or having an M6 toll tag, or having some means by which a camera recognises the registration plate of your vehicle, and you've gone past it, and therefore a back office system works out, well, there you go, you've crossed the Dartford crossing, or indeed in future you've gone through the Blackwall Tunnel, and some money's automatically taken from your account. It's sort of the automotive equivalent of touching in your Oyster card or your credit card. What I would say is I could point to any number of folks in the technology worlds who would say, but we could do a much more sophisticated thing, and the sort of thing that they would probably do at that point is wave their mobile phone at you and say, all of the technology that you need for the fabulously sophisticated scheme is here in the mobile phone that you've got. And in many ways that's true. What they I have found to stumble on is the difference between, for example, Christina saying, if you're going to drive in London in future, we want you to download the driving app, and we want you to make sure that you click on that so that whenever you're driving in London, your phone knows where you've driven, how well you've driven perhaps, how fast, how far, what times of day. How is that going to be policed, though? How are you going to check that I don't decide to leave my phone at home, which I'm of a certain age, I have done this a few times. How are you going to check that I've turned it on, I've downloaded the app, I've done all of the things I should do? So it's one thing to design a system that's capable of working. It's a lot harder to design a system that's very, very hard to cheat, or even just cheat by accident. So I would say that there are companies, I'm very happy to point the committee towards them. I would also say beware snake oil.
Yeah, that was fascinating, Steve. Thank you. I mean, it's that kind of like the underdevelopment of the tech, which I find odd given the kind of general policy direction globally we are moving towards with road user charging. So it's odd to me that the technology is behind on that. And I think that in part informs some of the questions that you raised, which is that kind of the behavioural changes that you would need alongside that tech, like, you know, not leaving your phone at home or making sure you switch on the app. We can't begin to answer those questions or think about solutions to those until we have a clarity on what the tech is. So I certainly think it'd be great for you to follow up with the committee and point us in the direction of those companies working on that. I hope we can see some kind of progression on that. Did anyone else in the panel wanted to add? Otherwise, I'll move on to my final question. Great. And Christina, I don't know if you wanted to come back on any of the specifics of the technology.
I'm afraid I don't have specifics
no, that's
and
fine.
brand
Don't
names
worry
and things.
about it. Okay, so the final question is, how can a future road user charging scheme be designed for the technology and systems to respect privacy rights? So whether that's individual data or GDPR. And I'll, again, start with yourself, Christina, and open it up to the rest of the panel.
Yeah, so I think this is something that will be really key, again, to kind of gaining public confidence, is understanding the way that data would be used and that would be used appropriately with GDPR. And that's something that, of course, would be kind of central to a scheme, that you need to make sure that you had that GDPR, and we would do data and privacy impact assessments. So that, I think, in terms of scheme design, would certainly need to be there, and we'd need to be able to be really clear with people about how that worked, because I'm sure that is something that could be concerning. And sorry, what was the second part of your question?
I mean, it was just that individual data in line with GDPR, how do we ensure technology respects those privacy rights?
Yeah, so I think that when you're looking at that tech solution, it will need to be there. And again, it's hard because we're not talking about a specific tech solution that we have now. But I think it would just need to be done in accordance with GDPR to make sure that you've got the right level of anonymisation. And again, this is something that in terms of, oyster journeys that are captured, but without, inappropriately sharing that data, it's something that we would need to follow in that same way.
Yeah, I mean, it'd be, again, good to open up to the rest of the panel if there were, for instance, best practice to point to where this is done elsewhere.
Just sort of building on what Christina said, there's a very clear framework and regulatory framework that needs to be followed around data privacy. And the Oyster example, we have a similar system, a tap-in, tap-out system for using public transport across the West Midlands in the same way you would observe and provide the privacy and provide the user with confidence around the anonymisation of personal data, etc. Those principles would continue to apply. Not that we're on the verge of introducing a road user charging scheme in the West Midlands, but again, it would be an area of concern for residents, businesses, users of a scheme, and therefore providing confidence around data privacy would be a key principle of any scheme design.
Great. And does anyone on the panel foresee any challenges in regards to ensuring data protection of individual rights? Steve?
Well, I think the only thing I'd say is that is it possible to design schemes in respect of road user charging or use of public transport or whatever in a way that is entirely compliant with GDPR and protecting my privacy rights? Yes, it is, and that's been proven. Do I trust them? They're subtly different questions,
yes.
And I think the challenge for public authorities is to take another daft example. So if this afternoon I went and drove across the Dartford crossing again, somebody in government would know that I'd done that. Does it bother me? Not really. What would they use that data for? I've got no idea. But I might be a little bit more just musing on, well, what is it they want to know about me if they didn't just know that I'd gone across the Dartford crossing, but they knew that I'd driven to Biggin Hill and had a drive round. And what was I doing in Biggin Hill? Now, I assure the committee my life is an open and rather boring book when it comes to travel. But I could well see some people thinking, well, why do they want to know this? Why does the system really need to know about the details of my trips? And that's where asking, well, what would make you feel comfortable then? And that can be in the system design as to, well, who is collecting this data? What company is it? Is it at arm's length? Because I think what would make people suspicious is if it were somebody like me in my last job, or Christina, looking at your movements on a screen, as opposed to a contractor who has no interest in your travel, but what they are interested in is making sure that the right amount of money is collected.
Yeah, Steve, I think you've put some really excellent questions back to the committee, and I think it would be fantastic to see the committee begin to answer those as we go on, because technology and data, I mean, data became the most valuable asset maybe 4 or 5 years ago. It superseded oil. And I think the ethical regulations around how data is used, who handles it, what it's used for, how it's collected, and how it influences marketing or other forms of influencing, whether that's an election time, or we saw with Cambridge Analytica, are really big ethical questions that we don't even know the questions that need to be asked, let alone the answers. And we certainly don't have that reflected in regulation or law. So I think making sure we're asking those in the context of future technology in regards to transport is vital. So thank you for putting them back to the committee, and hopefully the committee will be answering those questions or asking those questions in the future. Michael, you have your hand up, and then I'll pass back to the chair.
Very briefly, just to build on Steve's points, I think the points have already been made that Oyster shows that it is possible to deal with these issues in a way that people have some degree of confidence in. I think with regard to road user charging, the prospect might be a little bit different and more sensitive, depending on how granular the approach is to pricing and the retention. I mean, the fact is, Oyster tells you, that you've tracked your journey between 2 different parts of the public transport network. Potentially, smart road user charging can track your movement between a private address and a private address. And I think, I don't want to overdo it, but I think that's the sort of thing that, in the minds of the public, might just add a degree of sensitivity that is materially different to what we experience at the moment on the public transport network in London.
Yeah, I think that's a really excellent level of nuance to add to that. Thank you. Back to you, Chair.
Thank you very much. I was going to come in with a supplementary at this point, but I think Assembly Member Bailey has a further question. So if you can do that briefly.
really tiny. What chances do you think that this data would be provided to law enforcement? So if this data existed, would TfL provide it to law enforcement? Do you do that with Oyster data? What's the chances there? My mind reading abilities are failing today.
So in terms of Oyster, I'm not aware of there being arrangements of sharing that information with law enforcement, but just to reassure that if we were doing enforcement on a road user charging scheme, it would be purely for the purposes of that road user charging scheme. And I think that's probably the kind of clearest assurance I could give.
Okay, I'll come in at this point. These are some of my supplementary questions, not as chair, but as a member of the committee. We've had a bit of a discussion about privacy already, but we haven't discussed the current system that we have, which is the enforcement cameras for the ultra-low emission zone and soon to be the expanded ultra-low emission zone, which would presumably continue to be part of any kind of road charging scheme. The question that Steve was asking, what if I didn't pay? Well, your car registration plate would be travelling around the city and could be read by cameras so that you would at least know that you'd been in the city and could be charged a penalty. So at the moment, those camera reads are all fed to law enforcement. And that is in contrast to what goes on with the Oyster system. So the Oyster system, as has been discussed, knows when you've touched in and touched out. Sometimes it can connect that to you as a person if you've got a registered Oyster card. Sometimes it just knows that your credit card is doing it, so it doesn't know who that is unless somebody from law enforcement would come and connect your name to that credit card. But it has some idea of who you are. It keeps that data within TfL systems for about 30 days and doesn't share it with law enforcement unless it's specifically asked to, if that makes sense, if there's a live investigation. Whereas what happens with the ANPR cameras, the reads from those cameras and now the photographs, they are being shared with the Metropolitan Police, who are keeping them on a database for about a year. So that there's a big difference in privacy, and it is a concern for me that in general TfL's approach to privacy on the tube has been, and public transport system has been, different to how it's treated people driving around. And I think that probably does need a review if we're going to switch to a new system. So given you're sitting on working groups, Christina, I don't expect you to answer that you've already thought about that, although it does concern me you were slightly unaware of the law enforcement sharing already. Will you be making sure that those topics are discussed with the appropriate experts on those working groups? Because to my mind, making sure that a scheme is privacy friendly isn't something you retrofit at the last minute. It's something you build into the design from the start.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. And I was saying that there was no data sharing in terms of Oyster. I think I don't have the details of the data sharing with the police on the camera network with me, but I can follow up on that.
I can provide those to you if you would like.
I'm racking my brain because it's in there somewhere, but I'm not going to get it out now.
So the Assembly Oversight Committee looked at these issues a few years ago, so we've got chapter and verse on that.
Okay, fine.
Yeah.
But I think the really important thing I think to be clear about from our point of view is that our enforcement would be for the purposes of a road user charging scheme, and it wouldn't be looking to enforce against anything else. But I totally take the point that we need to be very clear about how that information is used, and if it is shared, the purposes of that sharing, and agree wholeheartedly that it needs to be built in from the beginning. And we'll be doing that with data privacy experts in TfL, of which I am not one. But yes, we'll make sure they're involved.
So I think Sandeep also mentioned anonymity, and that is the approach that's taken by Transport for London at the moment to the what's called MAC addresses that our phones transmit to the world and which get picked up at Transport for London stations. Now, this is really useful for a transport planning point of view, because it means that Transport for London can know how we change between lines, not just where we exit and enter the system, but where the actual journey we're taking. That data is anonymised, though, on a daily basis, so it can track you for the day and know where you've been about, but then it forgets who you are and it can't relate that to your future journeys. And that's that was done quite carefully. Is that the sort of system you might considering for a road user charging scheme, one where things are anonymised, more or less, and not kept in relation to people's identities?
So again, I don't think I can give kind of fully formed answers on what the technology will be. But yes, certainly in principle, I think the only purposes for which we would need that information would be to be able to accurately charge somebody at the end of that charging day, and there wouldn't be a need to kind of hold that information.
Okay.
So yes, I think I can give you the reassurance in principle about the privacy point and not holding data that we don't need to hold. But the specifics of how that would work, I can't answer yet.
Okay, thank you. That's really helpful. Not holding data you don't need to hold is one of the top principles. Sandeep, I can see you're getting ready to leave, unfortunately. Could we ask you to provide any more information on any of these issues that you have in writing to us? And do you know, just very quickly before you leave, whether or not there is a similar arrangement between West Midlands Police and West Midlands Transport Authority for sharing of data for long-term retention by the police?
Not that I'm aware of.
Would you be able to tell us?
I can find out from our we do a lot of work with our safer travel teams, etc., and West Midlands Police, but I can pick that up and come back to the committee. And indeed come back on any points that I feel are pertinent to your questions that have been discussed today.
Thank you very much. Cheers. It's really, really kind of you to come. And sorry we didn't have more questions for you today in the oral session.
Christina's done a great job of fielding most of them. So
I could see how this was going to go. Sorry.
Thank you.
Okay, so Assemblymember Prince, you were indicating, but I think yeah. Great, thank you very much. So I'm going to move on now to some consumer affairs in relation to this. We've talked about the complexity of the scheme, but there will be someone who needs to deal with complaints and appeals. And currently, for public transport, that is London TravelWatch. So, Michael, I wanted to ask you, I think it's fairly clear that you'd be the organisation tasked with dealing with those appeals after complaints on any new scheme, as you are for current schemes. Is that right? Are you under that impression too?
No one's formally asked us to do that, but I think it's a reasonable assumption. And I noticed actually that a couple of the witnesses in your December session said that it would be logical for there to be a single place, and that single place would be TravelWatch in terms of handling of appeals. The complaints would be handled by TfL to the extent that it's the manager for the new system. Obviously, raises a question of would we be resourced to carry out such a function, and it's difficult to be kind of precise at a stage in the discussion about road user charging where, if I'm honest, it's a bit fact light and detail light in terms of what nature of system coverage, and therefore the extent to which it gives rise to all sorts of complaints and appeals. But putting that to one side, our assumption is that given the proportion of instances, whether it's in terms of use of the public transport network through Oyster and contactless, or whether it's through use of the road network paid for through congestion charging, LES and ULES, our experience of the proportion of instances that ultimately end up in appeal, we would probably be dealing with something like the same order of magnitude in the event of the introduction of road user charging, subject to the technology working in the way that it wants to, subject to the simplicity, the front-end simplicity of the scheme to users, and subject to the way in which the scheme is enforced. But we think we would be able to manage it within, a reasonable level of resource. I think there's an issue of, in the early days of its implementation, as people are unused to it, whether there would therefore be, you would expect there to be a higher number of complaints that ultimately then lead to appeals, and we would certainly want to make sure that we're adequately resourced for that. But overall, we would think that it would be the right place for us to hold to have that responsibility, and that we'd be able to deal with it.
Okay, thank you. And currently, you do deal with complaints, and appeals following congestion charge, ultra low emission zone and low emission zone issues. Have you noticed that your workload has increased in recent years since the introduction of the expanded ultra low emission zone schemes?
The short answer is I don't think we have noticed a material change. I've just got figures actually for the last 2 years, and the number of appeals that relate to the TfL managed parts of the road network, which embraces more than just ULEZ and LES. But in 2021 we handled 101 appeals overall, and 2022 we handled 153 appeals. This is on the back of many millions of vehicle journeys being undertaken every year, whether it's through cars or goods vehicles. So it's a small proportion of the overall scale of movement that's going on, and that's the reason why, from a first principles point of view, our instinct is that we would probably be dealing with a similar scale of appeals on the back of road user charging, which of course would apply to many millions of car journeys every year.
Okay, that's interesting. Obviously, the London Assembly is your sort of umbrella body. If there are implications for resources, we definitely want to hear about them sooner rather than later. So please do keep an eye on that. Moving on to the next steps then, which is literally next steps. Assembly Member McCartney, you are to start on this section.
Yes, thank you. I think some of what I'm going to ask about has been covered, but we've talked about how a more sophisticated road pricing system could allow more nuance in people's journeys, charging for distance and whatever. In previous meeting, we talked about exemptions and discounts. Is it the case that we could have more nuance in that, for example, with the exemptions we give, or indeed should we have? And Steve, you want to go first? Yeah.
Well, as with so many other things we've touched on today, the answer is you can have them, and you can have quite a lot of them, and as soon as you announce that you're open to the idea, a lengthy queue will form. And what I would say is, if you're thinking, if Christina and others are thinking about the art of the possible here, there's a lot to be said for keeping things as simple as possible. And that does create a tension. Yeah. So on the one hand, there's always a desire to make sure that, as appropriate, people are protected. But whether the protection should come through the scheme or through some form of complementary measure is the thing that has to be taken into account. So much as we've been saying, if we don't want people to drive their car, well, have they got realistic alternatives? If the cost of driving the car is going to become more expensive, then what are we doing to help those potentially low-income households or whoever to maintain a happy, healthy lifestyle? So there is a tension there, and it's a tension that particularly, I think, if you're thinking about designing something that is city or conurbation specific, in the same way that vehicle excise duty, the government has not invited Christina to play with that. They haven't invited her to play with the social security system either. So yeah, there are limitations to what TfL could actually do.
Yeah, thanks. I think that's a very fair comment, and it actually leads me on to my next question, which is about those complementary schemes. And we have talked in the past about, particularly in outer London, some areas are not well served by public transport. And even in some areas where there is the bus network, it's perhaps not as frequent as we would like. Do any of you have any views about the extent to which public transport would need to be improved in order to say there is a real alternative? I don't know. Christina?
Yeah, sure. So I think we know that there would need to be continued investment in public transport in outer London, and that's something which is there already. And in fact, we've already got some bus network improvements which have been announced, including 1 million more kilometres added to the network. We've got 2 new bus routes in Sutton, which I know came up earlier. improved links between Harold Hill and Upminster in Havering, I'm not going to read them all out, new and improved services, but there, we've also got an additional 6 million additional funding announced in this draft budget, and we're looking then to go even further. So I think the commitment to going further and strengthening public transport in outer London is there. Obviously, like the Elizabeth line, Barking Riverside extension are also examples of recent improvements to public transport in outer London. But I think the principle that we need to keep providing new, better, competitive alternatives to the private car in outer London would definitely need to be part of this future thinking. And I think building on what Steve said, it's like looking at what are the broad mitigations that we need to have in place. So some of them might be things like discounts and exemptions. Some of them might be more around alternatives available, mobility credits. We've got reimbursement schemes and grace periods, and I think it's really about looking at what the specific impacts are and developing the right mitigations according to the kind of needs of the schemes and the people that will be interacting with them, rather than a kind of blanket approach.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Assembly Member Garrett, I think you had a supplementary here.
I think the discussion is partly being covered, and I'm conscious of time. But I'm just going to say this week I've had another email about, in this case, the Route 64, which connects up with the tram link down in Croydon. It's being cut by 25% the frequency. So alongside all of these constant, laundry lists from the Mayor and from yourself, Christine, about how things are getting better, it's, let's call it a mixed picture at best in outer London. And so, the point I made earlier, which I'm not going to repeat, but it is frequently 2 to 3 times longer for me to make a journey by bus in outer London. I usually just cycle because it's quicker. And other people drive because it's quicker. And I think there's just no real recognition of the magnitude of improvement that is necessary to really move the dial for people in outer London for let's say, a bus, because in my constituency, it pretty much buses is what we have, to actually get anywhere near what would be necessary in order to make it an equivalent journey time. And it does bother me a bit that there's all this talk of, encouraging people to change, very little talk about journey time, because that's one of the most important factors for most people's choice. If it takes twice as long, that's a much worse journey, even if it ticks a lot of environmental boxes. And I just think that really needs to be far more at the forefront of thinking in terms of the impact it's going to have on people.
Yep, understood. And I think apologies if I haven't been clear enough that it's not just about trying to kind of compel people to switch, but it's about making sure that the alternatives are attractive and they are competitive to cars. So acknowledging that level of service does need to be there.
Okay, thank you very much. You're the next question as well, so you might as well carry on.
Yeah, I will carry on. All I'll say is we're at the early stage of the project and everything is possible. And what happens as projects grumble along is that the things that are more sort of pie in the sky fade away, and the cost of providing significantly better public transport in outer London, I think that cost will start to look prohibitive, and so I don't think it will happen. But, I look to be proven wrong on that. I'm sure we'd all be delighted about that. My actual question I have here is about consultations, which we have covered a bit already, but question, if I go along, so I think everyone may want to have something to say. So I'll start with Steve. Thinking about the consultations and involving Londoners in discussion about this, what are your thoughts on how consultations can be done better to avoid cynicism and to actually make people feel that they're part of the decision-making process?
Well, I would say that let's be clear, it's not easy to make these things work really, really well. And my experience is people really want actual examples. So having a debate about something that's sort of theoretical is quite hard for a lot of us to grasp, because, and I think one of the other panellists said it this morning, we all tend to think, I can sort of see that we want less traffic somewhere, but how is this going to affect me, or how is this going to affect my next door neighbour who's disabled, or how is it going to affect the people at the end of my road? So in order to have a really effective consultation, you can go so far, but I think having the more sort of concrete examples of how do you feel if it worked like this helps people a bit more than just saying, well, we've just had this idea, what do you think? But I do recognise if you're thinking about something as complicated as we've discovered this morning, and thinking about a population as big and diverse as Greater London, it's not going to be possible to think of every single example. So it's what's the range of illustrations that can be thought through that in part help people understand you really have thought about this, haven't you? And I think that's the important thing.
It's a very good point. Thanks. Yes, it's not partly demonstrating that you've thought about it, and partly so people can understand in a tangible way, not just a theoretical way. Yeah. Thanks, Steve. Michael, did you have anything to add on that?
Yeah, two things. The first, very much supporting that last point. There needs something that people can grip, and I think prior to that, there is some, high quality modelling that needs to be done. The technocrats need to do that, but they then need to convert it into stuff that is accessible and understandable. The sort of thing that goes through my mind is sort of breaking down those big numbers and graphs or whatever into customer segments, typical customer segments, which is the sort of thing I think TfL does already in different places, but would be really helpful here in just making it feel real what the proposition is. And this conversation today has been quite difficult because we are talking in theory rather than around a proposition. Yeah. So that's point one. Point two, consultation, great. Co-creation, I think, would be really helpful, and it was something that Christina mentioned as in her earlier comments. It would be great for it to happen, and it would be great to understand what does that look like in the mind of TfL, the mayor, those who wish to push forward with this scheme. I mean, there's a reference to the fact that there is a steering group at the moment, I think, within TfL. Wouldn't it be great to have a few stakeholders either within that steering group or as a sounding board or a stakeholder board alongside it, which captures the breadth of interest groups, without making it unwieldy, but is representative of the sorts of demographic of London, the geographical diversity of London, which has come out in spades in this conversation. So co-creation and content.
That's really useful. Actually, a guest that we had at this committee on a different topic, Tom Cohen from the University of Westminster, has done some interesting work on this. Nick and I actually published an interview where we spoke about a bunch of things, but he had some really interesting thoughts on that. So I don't know if he's someone that the committee may want to ask again about this. But specifically, how you can involve people rather than just they feel spoken to.
Sorry, should we confirm that we should write to him and ask for feedback?
Please do. I mean, I think he has details. He's from the University of Westminster, Dr. Tom Cohen. I think he was here talking about shared mobility.
Yeah, I've taken part in a citizen jury that he organised in assembly, which is very much sort of one of the methods you might use. Great. Okay, we'll do that. Thank you.
Same question to you, Christina. So about a consultation. I suppose particularly thinking about the ULEZ consultation that's just happened. Reflections on that and how it might be done differently or similarly if there were consultations on this.
Yeah, and I think so that ULEZ consultation was, as you know, quite a wide-ranging consultation which covered the MTS and the ULEZ and some other changes to road user charging schemes and the future of road user charging. And we did that so that we could get people's kind of views and set out the full context of people, which I think was the right idea. But the kind of germ that we can take from that for the future of road user charging is that asked at a very earliest stage, and I think what we need to do now is make sure that dialogue is something which is built on. Sorry, I'm slightly repeating myself, so apologies, but being able to reflect on that and demonstrate to Londoners how that's helped influence our thinking, seeking kind of ongoing engagement with stakeholder groups, and people that we're having, kind of regular conversation with, is understanding what people want from a scheme. And I think it's really important that we're able to communicate that we are developing this based on what people are telling us we want, because that's what we're here to do, to develop good policy that develops the outcomes that we want to see for our city. And I think being able to have that ongoing engagement, including formal consultation, but not limited to formal consultation, I think that co-creation idea and that kind of dialogue rather than just set pieces will be really important to this.
Okay, and a final quick one. One of the things that I think ticks people off about surveys is if it's not possible for them to give the answer that they really want to give and they feel they're being steered in a direction. So on the ULEZ consultation, there wasn't a straight yes-no question. Do you think it's a good idea? Yes, no. It was sort of hidden in a question about timing, and you had to read through carefully, I think, one of 28 questions and pick never. Is that something you'll take on board and give people just a straight, do you think it's a good idea, yes or no question? Because otherwise you're going to have lots of questions about how and no question about whether.
So I think that this is a really interesting and important point, and of course we want to give people the opportunity to tell us what they want to tell us, and I think you'll always find in our consultations that there is a free text box that people can write whatever they want in, to be very specifically clear in their own words about what they want to say. There will always be that opportunity. In terms of how you word survey questions, I think the point of consultation for us really is to try and understand what people feel about the impacts of a scheme to help us shape it and understand it. It's not necessarily a vote on whether a thing will happen or not. And so the questions are designed usually to help us get that richness of information to help inform what we do, to gather that information. And as we've seen from these consultations, we've made changes to the proposals off the back of what we've heard. We introduced 2 new grace periods, for example, following the ULEZ consultation, as a result of what we heard during that consultation. And so the questions are designed to help give us that information. Okay. And there was, as you say, a question in there that enabled people to say we don't think it should be implemented, and that was in there. And there were also free text boxes. So we will do our best, obviously, to make sure that we are giving people questions and opportunities to tell us what they think about our proposals. But the richness of the information back about how people will be impacted and what we need to take on board is the really valuable part of that consultation process.
Okay, perhaps I've misheard again, but that did sound a bit like a no. You're not going to, because the basis of the consultation is that you want to go ahead with it and you don't really want to ask people a straight yes/no question.
I think the basis of the consultation is seeking feedback on proposals, which is what we'll continue to do.
But one bit of feedback is let's not proceed, whether that's a road scheme or a, anything else, a tunnel.
And there are free text boxes to allow people to say whatever they'd like to say. So I think no one's denied the opportunity to give us their views, and we welcome them all, and we read them all, and we respond to them all. But
you understand there's a difference between putting a question there which everyone will effectively be nudged into answering versus giving a free text box where people can write what they like. I mean, it does. I mean, you've given your answer and I appreciate it, but it does feed the cynicism that you're not really listening. The final question I had here from the questions on the sheet was about the TfL and the Mayor, how best to engage with Londoners on this topic from an early stage to shape a scheme before formal consultation stage. We've just been talking about formal consultation. What activities is or do you think should be TfL and or the Mayor be doing before it gets to that stage?
So I think I've probably spoken about this a bit already, but I think there's ongoing engagement with stakeholders, and that's through kind of regular meetings. I think as we work through this in more detail and we've got more that we can share, then that again, there'll be opportunities for us to engage, whether that's through different types of forum or whether there's kind of further rounds of informal kind of shaping consultation before you'd get to a formal consultation. But we're very open to looking at the best way to do that. So I don't have as I say, a kind of engagement programme now because we're at that early stage, but we're very open to suggestions, and if people have views on good ways that we can engage Londoners, then we are very happy to hear them.
Well, since you say that, Michael, what suggestions do you have for how TfL and or the Mayor could engage before the formal consultation?
I think we need to move from theory to something which feels like a practical idea, even before the formal consultation. I think the surveys have been done by others around the sort of topics that we've been talking about. I think people need to get a feel of what does this thing actually look like if you want to have a meaningful conversation with people, whether it's through surveys or otherwise, about what they think.
So it needs to be a specific idea, or maybe 2 specific ideas,
some
rather than
options or scenarios, but something that answers all those sorts of questions which have been raised today about, well, what sort of pricing, I don't mean absolutely specific, but something which gives some tangible content about kind of cost, location, benefit, improvements, timing of all of that. I think this is all kind of fairly obvious stuff, but I think the idea has already been put out there that this is something that not just this Mayor, but I think it's been referred to, with previous Mayor, that is potentially on the table to be taken forward, and there's been a lot of debate about it at theoretical levels, and I think we need to move on. I think with an open mind, because I think actually when people really bite on a proposition, it may become obvious that yes, they would like to go ahead, but cautiously. It may equally become more obvious that when they see the colour of it, they say, well, hang on a minute, I'm not sure that was what I thought I was actually signing up for in theory. And I think we do have to have that open mind. Personally, I think, it's something that's capable of being delivered, but all sorts of conditions to be secured first.
Okay. Oh, Steve, did you have something on that same question?
Just briefly add there, if my chum Tom Cohen were here, he would say, have you thought about some deliberative forums like the sort that I've arranged? So, and I think there is an important point here, which is sometimes if one's posing a question to everyone, it's quite hard for everyone to engage with it, and it's quite hard to get everyone up to a similar level of understanding of what you're trying to do and what the nuances are. Whereas if you invite, hopefully, a representative cross-section of people in a series of gatherings and take the time to say, here's what we're thinking about, here's why we're thinking about it, here are some of the things that we're taking into account, but what do you think? Picking up Michael's point. So thinking about that rather than a sort of a London-wide consultation, a process in which some separate gatherings are had. And I would definitely think start with what's the problem you're trying to solve, or what's the thing you're trying to achieve? Because if you start with, I'd like to talk to you about road pricing, I would say it's a bit like, I'd like to talk to you about income tax, I'm thinking of putting it up, how do you feel? You'll get a different reaction.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much. Assembly Member Desai with some further questions.
Well, not really, because I think both my questions have been answered, but I will still ask them. So really, my two questions, which, as I say, have been answered to a large extent, is to TfL, and some of the questions really should have been put to the non-TfL guests instead of to you, Christina. But my first question was about the diversity of consultation. So can you put more flesh on the answers that have already been given? So reference has been made to people with disabilities, but I mean, how do you actually practically propose engaging with the diverse range of Londoners?
Yes, so I think this is a really important part of engagement and consultation, and engaging some of those harder to reach groups is really important and is not always that easily done by just kind of making available the online survey, and we have to make sure that we go to greater efforts to engage with them. And I think the recent consultation was a good example of, we spent a lot of time meeting with and engaging with disability stakeholders in particular, because this was raised as a concern as part of the ULEZ proposals, and we did workshops. I attended workshops and meetings, so did other members of the team, and really trying to get to grips with people's lived experience, and then being able to kind of talk at more length and explain their circumstances. And I think understanding that is really key. So, sorry.
Yeah, I think you're talking very generally, but can you give sort of some practical examples, and not just people with disabilities, important as those Londoners are, but other diverse sort of groupings? I mean, how do you actually intend reaching out to them? Because you're talking in very general terms.
Yes, so we have stakeholder engagement teams who literally kind of hold relationships with stakeholder groups which represent people from across the whole spectrum. There's the Independent Disability Advisory Group within TfL. We've got a youth panel within TfL. So there are groups internally who we can kind of be engaging as we move through, as well as external stakeholders. But we do have links into local communities and partnerships and boroughs, and we use some of those organisations to help reach out to their members. Again, and this goes across kind of freight organisations and business and economy organisations. There's a wide range, so I can follow up with you separately if it'd be helpful to kind of set out what the stakeholder relationships that we have and how we use them.
Okay, at last, the committee actually, in relation to bus proposals last year, made some recommendations about consultation. So will you consider carrying out more detailed impact assessments on different options before any decisions are made about a future road user charging scheme?
Yes, so I think it will be really important to assess a range of options and not just kind of narrow down on one set of proposals and look at those. I think we'd be happy to commit to assessing that.
Thank you very much. I just have a final question there about this idea that you've consulted recently on quite sort of legal changes, like the change to the transport strategy and a specific scheme that you were trying to consult on before you went ahead with it. Am I right that when you get to the point of wanting to pursue one thing, there is only legally the option to consult on that one thing, or could you put forward more than one alternative and ask people to give their views on which is preferable, and then make a decision to go ahead with one of those? Or do you then have to do a separate consultation on the option you choose? So just from a legal point of view,
so
is that possible?
For a road users charging scheme, we'd be consulting on a kind of draft scheme order, if you like. So I think this goes back to the multiple rounds, and I think we shouldn't be trying to kind of do one round of consultation that does everything for everybody. And I think that's why this consultation was useful, because we can ask some questions about high-level options. I think there is potential to have further rounds of consultation which could have more options in them. What do you think about this one versus that? You can have that. I think the final consultation on final statutory consultation would probably need to be on your final set of proposals. So in relation, those two questions clash a little bit then. So you've just committed that you want to do, consultation and detailed impact assessments on a range of options. And then the legal people within your team will push back and go, well, because this is not the final consultation, you don't need to do a full equality impact assessment, and that costs money and all of that. So can you commit to us today that you would provide the fullest possible information on multiple options at the stages at which you're still considering multiple options or variations within a theme? Yeah, so I think what I'm very happy to commit to is that, so I can assure you that we'll be looking at more than one option. So we will be looking at optioneering as we go through. We will be assessing the impacts of those options as we go through, and we're happy to engage on all of that. When it comes to what's in, if we even, whatever stage in time that you have a final set of proposals, and I don't know when that would be, for a future road user charging scheme, it would come with a full set of impact assessments, and those usually do contain another case, another scenario within them as well. But I can commit that as we go through and we're looking at different options, we will assess them properly.
Okay, yeah. I mean, it does seem to us, like particularly with the bus consultation, the feedback that we gave there, that another stage would have been great, because at that point, I think you found out in that bus consultation, not you personally, but TfL, found out in that bus consultation additional impacts you were not considering in the original equality impact assessment. And that kind of rolling feedback where people go, actually, this is going to affect me, and you go, okay, in that case, I will go and assess how it affects you and whether that changes our minds. That has been absent from recent consultations.
But I think that's a really important part of consultation, that we will do our best to assess all the impacts, but then that's why you're asking people, what are the impacts, and are there things that we haven't properly considered or that we've missed? And that consultation is an opportunity for that, and we can still change the proposals after that. And we write those up in the case of road user charging, we write that up in a report to the Mayor to say, these are the issues that people have raised, these are changes that we're proposing that you make to the final, recommended changes to the proposals for the decision maker to take. So I think it's good that people are able to raise things during consultation, and that we can continue to flex after that.
Okay. Well, thank you. We'll continue to feedback on this as a committee. We'll come up with some recommendations around next steps as well. I think that is the end of our meeting. Again, thank you so much to the guests. It's been really interesting to talk about this in public. I know it's not something that's been able to be talked about in public much up until now, so it's just really good to have you doing that, particularly TfL. If there's anything you want to add to what you've told us today, or any further information that we might have hinted we'd like, please do send it in. We'll follow up with some further questions in writing as well. Right, the committee has a few more items of business to deal with, but in the meantime, guests, please feel free to leave the chamber. Can I ask the committee to note the report and the discussion?
Noted.
Can we also delegate authority to meet as chair in consultation with the deputy chair and party group lead members to agree any output arising from the meeting?
Agreed.
Can we also note the work programme and upcoming meeting dates?
Noted, agreed.
And then I want to confirm that the next meeting of our committee, the last of the year, will be our annual Q&A with, I believe, the Commissioner and the Deputy Mayor attending on the 21st of March 2023 at 10 o'clock here in the chamber. I do not have any other urgent business, so thank you. The meeting's now closed. Thanks, everyone.
Didn't know the Deputy Mayor was